Good afternoon, folks. We will begin. Bienvenue, bon après-midi. Je suis Francis Bradley, je suis le PDG d'Électricité Canada. I'm Francis Bradley, I'm the CEO of Electricity Canada. Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Vancouver is also home to the Métis Nation of British Columbia and the British Columbia Métis Federation. Thank you to each of you for joining us here and from wherever you are, because we do have participants that are joining us on the virtual platform. And I'd like to honor each of your traditional territories as we come together from all across the country. Just a very quick note. Emergency Management BC conducts a test of the Alert Ready system twice per year. Guess what? One of those tests is going to be in about 52 minutes this afternoon. So if suddenly everybody's phone goes off because of the alert system, it is that once or twice a year test by Emergency Management BC. Listen, it's great to be with you here today, actually in person. As everybody is likely aware by now, because of the logos that you see on the documentation on the tables, this March we changed our name to Electricity Canada from the Canadian Electricity Association. And we did this for a lot of reasons, but the biggest can be summed up in our new tagline, Our Energy Future. Because we believe that electricity is going to be absolutely indispensable in the coming years as we work to stop the effects of climate change. Today is May 4th, 2022, and we have 4,990 days left to meet the government's goal to have an electricity grid that is net non-carbon emitting by 2035. And we also have to look at least doubling our output so that Canada's economy is fully decarbonized by 2050. 4,990 days. If Canada wants to achieve the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, then energy companies need the freedom to invest in solutions that will help make that happen. Currently, environmental benefits, including GHG reductions, are not actively considered in the decision-making process of many utility regulators, each of whom interprets and follows the utility legislation in their province or territory. We've seen this firsthand with many electricity companies in Canada who need to do more and faster to increase the capacity of the electricity grid and to reduce GHG emissions, only for it to be hampered by outdated legislation. In Canada, over 55% of all energy used by consumers is delivered on regulated infrastructure. And provincial and territorial economic regulators focus first on minimizing end costs to consumers. This essentially means that until legislation and policy-making changes to account for emissions reductions, progress towards environmental targets will continue to be stifled as utilities are hindered from investing in solutions that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enable net zero emissions by 2050. 2 weeks ago, the Canadian Gas Association and Electricity Canada released the Flagship Report titled Net Zero, an international review of energy delivery systems, policy and regulation for Canadian energy decision makers. This report presents international case studies and a roadmap for Canada to amend and update utility regulatory policy and legislation, and we'll be talking about that on one of the later panels. But central to the report's finding is that Canada must prioritize the creation of a time-limited task force with a mandate to develop concrete legislative and policy reform. The task force would convene federal, provincial, and territorial policymakers and regulators alongside Indigenous and municipal governments and organizations, industry, civil society, and academic leaders to identify policy, legislative, and regulatory barriers. The work of such a task force would not supplant existing efforts towards emissions reductions, but rather serve to reinforce, to better coordinate, and to strengthen them. Policymakers in Canada need to pay serious attention to the recommendations of this report because there are 4,990 days left to decarbonize the electricity grid, and Canada's net zero goals rest on this. Now, to accomplish that, we need regulation designed for the 21st century. It now gives me pleasure to kick this off by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Thierry Brosse, who I had the opportunity to interview earlier this week. Dr. Brosse is a leading European energy expert, and today he'll be discussing the root causes of the current energy crisis. He will also identify some key insights that can inform Canadian regulators, policymakers, and other energy stakeholders as we move towards a net zero energy grid. And following this, he will be joining us live for questions that you may have. So please note your questions. There will be an opportunity for some dialogue with Dr. Thierry Brosse at the conclusion of this. And so with that, here is the conversation I had with Dr. Brosse. All right, well, welcome. I'm glad you were able to join us. Why don't we start with the current situation in Europe? That, of course, has been certainly very volatile. But can you give us an update from what you're seeing in terms of what the current situation is, and also particularly what this means for regional energy policy?
Yes, thank you, Francis, for having me. The situation is evolving extremely fast. I mean, if I just try to sum up what happened in the last month, in April, 1st of April, the 3 Baltic states started to say they were able to do without any Russian gas. So this is not a big deal because this is 2% of the amount of Russian gas from exports to Europe. So completely possible to mitigate this with other extra gas coming from different areas. Unfortunately, on the 27th of April, Vladimir Putin decided to cut off Poland and Bulgaria, which is another 8%. So in the last month of April, we've lost 10% of our Russian piped gas supply. And perhaps for your audience to be aware, Russia represents 40% of the total EU gas demand. So it is something we can do. I mean, prices have not spiked so much, but there is what I would call a weaponization of gas in this process. This started, I would say, nearly a year ago. And so we have to be prepared for what's going to be the next step. And unfortunately, in the system, there is a systematic risk, which is the fact that because we are too much dependent on Russian gas, if this was to be cut in Russian gas to Germany, then Europe will face systemic risk because we are too much dependent. So I think we are at this period right now. As we speak, the energy minister of the 27 member states are meeting and are trying to find ways, because you know that the next step is Vladimir Putin requested us to pay in rubles the gas we are buying, which is not in the contract. And so the question is, are we going to be united, the whole of Europe, or are some going to be free riders and try to answer Vladimir Putin's request positively?
So what's your best guess on that? Will Europe remain united?
It's going to be very difficult. I think Vladimir Putin so far believed that Europe was not going to be united. Interestingly enough, you know that to decide an embargo, we need unanimity of member states, and we managed to get it on call. We are discussing on oil and gas, but we manage it this, which I think is a huge first step for Europe. So there's been unanimity. We've tried so far to be united, but again, because there is this risk of systemic failure, I mean, the Germans may be very difficult to convince to try to put an embargo on oil or on gas, or may be willing to pay their gas in rubles. So far, they said no. So far, we have a little bit of blur situation in Hungary and in Austria, which may be willing to pay in ruble, which is not what the other countries have stated.
Yeah. Okay, well, you'd mentioned the 40% before the war began of Europe's natural gas was coming from Russia. European countries are seeking to reduce their dependence by 2/3 in 2022. So what do you think is the potential of this, or limitations of specifically of electrification to offset this demand for natural gas? So what role will electrification play to try and hit those significant targets of reducing by 2/3?
Well, two-thirds is, I would say, wishful thinking from the European Commission, because at the end of the day, what matters to us is the amount of money we send to Russia, because we are sending something like a big, if I do the whole of the coal, the gas, and the oil, we are sending to Russia something like $1 billion per day for our energy bill. So the idea is to try to reduce this to the maximum and try to make sure that this money doesn't finance the war in Ukraine. The limitation is, well, as you know, I mean, you can't do a U-turn overnight in an energy system. It takes quite a long time. And interestingly enough, I've talked to you about the Baltic states, I've talked to you about Poland and Bulgaria. All those 5 states had foreseen this risk and had tried to address this risk ahead. And they had done some investment. Lithuania with the regas terminal, Poland with the regas terminal, some with interconnection, some with a new pipe connecting Norway to Poland going to come out soon, later this year, and one going to connect Greece and Bulgaria. So, but those pipes are nearly finished because they were decided back a decade ago. So that's also what I think is very important in this energy situation and in this energy mess. The one that were able to foresee this and to try to reduce the risk are now in a much better position versus the others that didn't foresee the risk. So I think for an energy transition, we need to plan this well in advance. And what I would also say is magic math doesn't work. So it's not because you say it's going to reduce that things are going to reduce. I mean, you were talking about this reduction of 2/3. If at the end of the day we manage to get this, which I think is very difficult, but at the end of the day, because in those contracts there are take-or-pay obligations, and we continue to pay for gas that we don't take from the Russian, we have the worst of 2 worlds. So I think we need to look at it really on a contractual basis and really with a decade view. So what do we want to do in the next decade? And you know, as well as me, that if you want to move away from the usual cars to electric vehicles, you need to massively increase the supply of electricity. And this means more electricity to be produced. It's not only a question of rare earths, what everybody is talking about. Also, it's a question of new electrical plants. I mean, I've made this, the back of the envelope calculation. If France was to ban all thermic vehicle and say, well, from today or from tomorrow, we are going to allow only ICE vehicle on the street to be sold, just not, and keep the old one, but just a new one can only be electric vehicle, then we will need 1 nuclear reactor to be put in production every 2 years. So, I mean, those are the things. And so therefore you cannot go into saying, I want this, and then on the other side, not do the investment to generate more electricity in the coming years. But you're right, we are going to face I would say 2 to 3 years of hard, difficult demand reduction because we didn't forecast what happened in terms of the weaponization of Russian gas.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about that in terms of the preparation. I mean, looking back, France, Germany, and other EU countries such as Spain have taken different approaches in anticipation of the energy transition over the past decade or two. What are any insights that you could draw from these, especially in light of the current situation?
Well, in light of the current situation, as I stated, I mean, the countries that were really smart in trying to address the diversification of supply are the ones that are much better off today. I mean, something that is perhaps not understood very well. I mean, Spain 20 years ago was highly dependent on Nigerian gas, and Spain has made the investment in loads of regas terminal to reduce this dependency. And Spain now is completely, the security of supply in Spain is extremely at a high level. As I said, Poland has made this regas terminal investment. Lithuania has made it also. So if you are planning this ahead, then you can do this and you have time to do this. Emergency is not a very good thing. I mean, on the other side of the coin, I mean, you see Germany, which was talking about regas terminal for the last 15 years, but was always trying to kick the can down the road, because Germany was always saying, well, it's going to be more expensive than Russian gas. True. I mean, the cost of LNG is more expensive than the cost of Russian gas, but we are talking of prices, and we are talking about a premium to insure yourself against the risk. So you shouldn't look at those just on a cost basis. And as we are speaking, Germany has no regas terminal, is still thinking of building or fast tracking two new to be built. But as I said, Germany is a systemic risk in Europe because this wasn't done properly. So I think we need to look at this. And again, I mean, what we've always banked on, which was a reduction of demand, which never happened. We also have to see how we want this to happen. And I think here there is something different in this situation. We are at war, not directly, but indirectly. And the war is not very far from where I speak, in fact. And so what we could say to our people is, well, we need this time to really try to reduce demand. As I was telling you earlier, I mean, we are going to face 2 or 3 tough years. And so the thing is to say to our people, well, let's try to reduce demand today as fast as we can, because otherwise, if we don't do it, we are going to face demand destruction in the winter, i.e. we are going to close down plants, or we are going to be forced to reduce your heating at home. So I think there is an education process, and this education process, which was very difficult during peacetime, could be done during wartime, saying to people, well, this is because we don't win, we don't want to send money to Vladimir Putin to pay for his war in Ukraine.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm kind of looking at comparisons between what's taking place in and the structures really in the EU and Canada, and to a certain extent, the EU would, in many ways, looks a lot like Canada. You know, with regional control of electricity, but then also with tight economic integration. So I'm wondering, do you see any specific challenges or any opportunities that really result from this sort of mismatch between tight economic integration and you know, sort of regional control of electricity?
Well, I think one of the major success of the EU Commission in the last 10 years was to put public money to build those interconnections, to make sure that those interconnections that were sometimes not profitable for those interconnections to be built. I mean, in the gas, for example, gas was flowing from east to west. We made the investment, I mean, public money made the investment for gas to flow from west to east. And this is what's now helping Poland, what's helping Ukraine to have gas outside the Russian hand. And I think this is very important. And if I would say, I think, and again, you've seen this perhaps not in Canada, but you've seen this in Texas. If you're not well connected, then if you have a supply disruption can happen. I think we are seeing the worst supply disruption because it's coming from what is now an enemy. But supply disruption can happen inside your own grid for whatever reason happens. Again, I speak, I'm French. I mean, we've seen half of our nuclear plants that are being stopped because we have to check a few things inside those nuclear plants. And so this was not planned. And so if we are better interconnected with others, then we are more resilient. So I would say this, I think the resilience comes with better interconnection.
How was the European Union able to get past those challenges and invest public money into projects that were transnational? That's always been the challenge here. Is you know, who pays for the you know, and the increased regional integration, because there's, you know, there isn't necessarily the same value for everybody along that chain. How did you get past those challenges of you know, individual states' views?
That's exactly what I was saying. This was the real challenge. And to overcome these challenges, we looked at the European level and stated that some projects were what we called project of common interest. And so therefore, it was not only between two states, but there was a general European interest. And so therefore, there were going to be some public money. And this public money helped the public money from the European side helped, because as you rightly stated, I mean, if you look at your cross-border adjustment and if you look at who wins and who loses, I mean, the one who loses doesn't want to pay for the one who wins. I mean, there is a very famous pipe between Spain and France that never took off because we never managed to get through those maths. But if at the end of the day, you get the pipe or the line viewed as project of common interest and you get some public European support, then this helps the system.
All right. There's a lot of commonality in those challenges between the EU member states and provinces here. So that's something that there might be some lessons that we can draw from there. Let's talk a little bit about, and we haven't gotten to it yet, but intermittent sources of electricity, and there is significant penetration now of intermittent power, in particular wind generation resources. What has this meant for the EU energy system and electricity markets? This growing use of intermittent resources within the system.
Yes, if I look at broad numbers, I mean, EU as a whole relies for its electricity generation for 26% from its renewables. So that's wind and solar, and then you add another 12% for hydro. So that's, and this is the average. So you would say that in some states it's much more, it's above 40%. So, I mean, two things. First of all, I think we have to keep in mind, and this is something the wind industry and the solar industry are not, I think, too much honest about this. We need to understand that this will create more volatility in the system. More volatility in the system, which means if and I used to sit in a bank next to traders, which means more volatility in prices. And I think this is where, again, we or the governments have to step in and to say, well, people don't like volatility, so how are we going to manage this in a way that is acceptable for the people? And not only to the wealthy people that can have a battery in their house or an electric car, and so use the electric car or the battery to smooth the thing, but to others who don't have this opportunity. And I think I used to be a civil servant back 20 years ago, and one of the big mistakes we made was fuel poverty. We thought that fuel poverty wasn't going to happen because this was dogma at the time. The dogma was liberalization, we reduce prices and fuel poverty would be eliminated. If you go back to what the British literature was about this in the 2000s, this was exactly this. And I think what we need to understand is this volatility system is going to increase because policymakers are now blaming it on volatility of the gas prices. No, it's not volatility of the gas prices. I mean, it's the volatility of the electricity production that generates the volatility in the gas. So it's not because you're going to take off the gas that you're going to reduce the volatility. And again, people don't like volatility. So we have to find a way. And I think this is the real challenge today. How do policymakers make sure that they are trying to smoothing volatility for the final customers, for the voters?
And how successful have they been up until now, and what's the prospect of being able to address that volatility, particularly for the end customer?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was little success because the idea was to blame it on the fossil, saying, well, it's the fossil fuel that are volatile. I mean, yes, when there is no wind and no sun, you need more gas, and so therefore the price of gas goes up. And on top of it, we are facing a weaponization of gas, which doesn't make the system easier to understand. But I do think we have to look at it in an integrated way, perhaps with batteries. But again, I've always stated that the gas industry as such, and this is changing in particular in Europe right now, because we have in Europe quite a lot of gas storage, the storage can play the smoothing of this element. So
Right.
we have to be able to play it on different level and to provide those elements. Interestingly enough, I mean, we've seen weaponization of gas, as I told you, and I think it started, by the way, a year ago when Gazprom didn't refill their own storage in Europe. Because if we have full storage, if our storage are full at the beginning of winter, i.e. 90% full, then we are in a position to have security of supply in Europe and also to provide this security of supply to the broader world. I mean, it's
Right.
normally an LNG cargo that has been reloaded in Europe that goes into Boston if there is a problem in the US, or goes into China if there is a problem in China in plain winter. So it's because we had poor level of storage because of this weaponization of gas that we faced extreme high prices at the end of last year. And we are in the process by changing the regulation right now in Europe. The regulation in Europe is going to force gas players to have 90% of the storage completely full by 1st of October. So therefore, this will be able perhaps to smooth volatility. So this is what I'm saying. You need to play on different level, on different commodities, if you want to address something that customers are not happy with, which is volatility of prices. They don't like volatility of prices. They don't like high price, which is something different. And high price, unfortunately, I think is something that is embedded with this energy transition. We've also forgotten to say to our people that they are going to have to pay higher prices. On top of it, we are facing a crisis, which is making it even worse. But the energy transition was going to be kickstart with higher prices.
Let me pull on that thread a little bit. Specifically, what the impacts are on customers. So we've talked about the different approaches in different countries in the EU. What have the different approaches meant for the end consumers? Right? There are different experiences ultimately for consumers in different jurisdictions in the EU, and what are the challenges or opportunities or any learnings that have come out of this?
Well, two things. First of all, there are customers that are willing to be pro consumers, and so therefore are going to be able to balance the grid. But again, I think it's more the elite, it's more the wealthy, and this is not the average person. And so therefore we have really to keep this in mind. Plus, we have to think about how do we do this, how do we provide this electricity, how do we provide those gases to our people in a way that is acceptable to climate and to them. I mean, we are talking, for example, in Europe about pricing CO2 for a broader use of gas. Right now, the CO2 is mostly paid by the power generation. We would like, policymakers would like this to be paid by people in their houses or by people using oil for the car. It is something that is going to be difficult. And again, I'm coming from a country where we had the yellow vest when we increased too much the cost of the commodity. So I think we have really to, I would say, first educate the people. We have to tell them that they need to consume less, and unfortunately, it will cost more.
Yeah, you mentioned the yellow vests and the experiences that you saw specifically in France. What about the recent French presidential election and the re-election of President Macron? Are the results of the election going to mean any changes for French or EU energy policy, or is it going to be continuing along the same path?
Well, for EU, remember that France was leading the EU, the 27 member states, for the first 6 months of the year, so this won't change. The interesting thing is perhaps on the geopolitical scene, as you've seen, there hasn't been any decision on an oil embargo against Russia because we were going through a presidential election, and so therefore France couldn't really push for this because we weren't aware who was going to win the election, and on a democratic process you have to wait, I would say, for this. So France wasn't, I would say, leading the EU in the last few weeks, unfortunately, and I think President Macron will go back as the leader of the EU on this. And again, he is now, I would say, the natural leader for the EU heads of states. In France, President Macron made a U-turn on nuclear during his first 5 years in office. He started by closing a nuclear plant, and he ended up saying he wants to build 6 to 40 new nuclear plants. The problem of this is we have to go through another election, which is the MPs, and members of parliament are going to be elected in June, and we don't know exactly who's going to be elected. And we have part of the population that are even against any new nukes or wanting to close the nukes, as this was done in Germany. And I think this goes back to perhaps the first question about a crisis. I think we need a pragmatism in this system. I mean, we cannot go and say we want to go to a net zero and on top of this, if we are French, and stating we are going to close our nukes, and not build new nukes and build more renewable, because the amount of investment that's going to be needed to achieve this is just impossible. So let's use the old nuke as long as they are safe. And again, right now, half of the nukes in France are closed because we need to address a technical problem, and hopefully this will be addressed and they can go back on the grid. But I would say that any leader that comes, and that's a problem in Germany right now, that says, well, in the middle of the worst energy crisis we are witnessing in our lifetime, some leaders saying, I want to close nukes is completely stupid, because we are going to lose supply and lose supply without CO2. And again, I think we have to keep in mind, I mean, people are always talking about the risk of rare earths when you move to ICE vehicle. Well, you need also to think about where you're going to produce this electricity, because it does use electricity. And again, I mean, the mass 2 million ICE vehicle every year will mean that you will need half a nuclear plant every year to power those. And if you don't do this, to revert to using coal-fired power plants, which is even worse than having the diesel car. And again, I think that people are trying to understand this, because one of the experience we found out of this crisis, if I can go back to my cars, is that in Europe, in the last 10 years, we've pushed for dieselization of the cars. So moving from your basic petrol to diesel. And this was not only for trucks, but for cars. And this has been made massively, because if you look, it was cheaper because there was less taxes, and you have more energy per unit of volume. So, I mean, it makes sense on one way or another. But Europe was, contrary to North America, one of the places on Earth where we had the biggest amount of diesel cars. The problem with this was that we didn't do dieselization in our refineries. So our refineries in Europe are producing too much petrol and not enough diesel. So the too much petrol is exported to the US or to North America. And how do we get the too little diesel? Well, we get it from Russia. So in fact, and you've seen on the pump in North America, in the US in particular, diesel prices going way higher than petrol prices, because in Europe right now, if we put an embargo on Russian oil and Russian oil product, it's diesel that's going to be missed in the system. So interestingly enough, people that bought a diesel car back 2, 3, 4 years because they were told it's going to be cheaper to operate, have now a diesel that is 20% more on wholesale prices than the price of normal gasoline. And so this is why I'm saying, going back to the energy transition we were talking earlier, it needs to be planned, and you need to plan the different moving parts, because otherwise you're going to find yourself stuck in a position you wouldn't thought of.
And at that juncture, we're going to take a pause here. and give us an opportunity now to turn to our live audience in Vancouver and see what questions come up from the floor. I have plenty more questions, but I'm sure there are questions from the folks that are here at the conference itself.
Okay, and so we'll have both some roving microphones and an opportunity for folks that are participating virtually to send questions in. And I will actually kick things off. Voilà, merci. Bonjour Thierry. I'll just kick things off with a very quick question for Dr. Boss, and that is, a question that I ask everybody that comes on to the Flux Capacitor podcast, and that's for a book recommendation to add to our Flux Capacitor book club, to our reading list. So Thierry, for you, is there a specific book that you would want to recommend to our audience here?
Yes, Francis. Hello to everybody. A great book that I read a few months ago, which is The World for Sale, which is a story about the traders, those people that are making money, yes, and this is the story about this from Jack Farshi and another journalist, but also why this is needed and why they were really successful in the 20th and 21st century.
Okay, The World for Sale. Thank you very much. Okay, questions either here in the live audience or questions from our people participating virtually. Okay, we've got nothing on the virtual side either. All right. Justin Cruson. Okay, Justin has a question.
Sure, yeah, I didn't want to hog it right up front, but Justin Cruson, Electricity Canada. I was curious, I've heard, so as there's been an increased reliance on power in Europe, you spoke of the energy security scenario with interties and all that. I've actually heard that Scandinavian countries at one point were preventing power from rolling through their jurisdictions to other jurisdictions in order to kind of save prices domestically. Can you speak to that a little bit further? Is that situation kind of straightened itself out? And what are the long-term implications if you can't rely upon, or the kind of security of your supplier in energy markets is able to basically be rescinded?
Yes, I think you're right. It goes back to the infrastructure and what I was talking earlier about the need to have a resilient infrastructure. I mean, if you look at Germany, for example, I mean, some of the production now is going to be in the north, some of the major demand is going to be in the south, and so because Germany, for example, doesn't want to build those electricity lines, then the electrons are going through the other countries, which is putting a stress on the other grids. So I think we need the whole thing to be better planned, and we need, as I stated earlier, to have some spare capacity and some resilience in the system. I think now, I mean, the system about electrons or gas not flowing to others hasn't been a big issue in the last few months, but it could become one in the gas industry, because as you know, there is this solidarity mechanism that should kick in. And I was talking about the storage earlier, just to give you the kind of scale we are facing right now in Europe. If we want to refill our gas storage for next winter, i.e. in the next 4 months, we need to have $100 billion US dollar to pay for this gas, because the gas prices are so high. And then there is a question about who's going to use this gas, because at the end of the day, if we are facing a cutoff from Russia later in the winter, then there may be some of the storage that has been paid by company A that is going to be used by company B for residential in another country. So those are really tough questions that we need to address, and we need to address them in real time and in an emergency. I mean, the solidarity mechanism in gas is on the paper. It has been written on the paper. I think I was one of the fathers of this back 20 years ago, but it has never been tested. And I think this is the acid test, if I can say so.
Okay. I believe the next question is over here with Michael Cleland. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. In a sense, this question just follows from what you just said, Tidia. We talk about gas as kind of gas going somewhere, but the question is, and it has important policy implications, what proportions go to power generation, order of magnitude, and what proportions to space heat or industrial process heat?
More or less, it's broadly at Europe, it's a third, a third, a third. In France, it's completely different, but it's a third, a third, a third for this right now. And again, this could change in the coming months, because if we have to do without Russian gas, we will have to face a demand reduction of 10%. And then there is the question, how do you do a demand reduction of 10%? Well, unfortunately, it's not going to be the residential, so it means that the two others will have to take the biggest part of this 10%, which means that for the power generation, it could be us burning more coal. So I think it's also very important to think of it, Francis, you were mentioning when you start this energy transition. We have new targets for 2030 and 2050. 2050 targets are for net zero. 2030 targets may be missed because, unfortunately, a bit like Texas in the freezing period, we may have to use whatever is left, unfortunately means coal, if we are facing a gas disruption. And I think we could face this because since the broadcast we had earlier this week, Francis, the European Commission did put today a ban on an embargo on Russian oil and Russian gas that should be looked by heads of states in the coming days. We need the unanimity to decide this, but at least now Russia knows that we want to get out of Russian oil and oil products.
Okay, we'll squeeze in two more questions. Mr. Colasar will be the first of the two.
Thank you very much. Do you think there's going to be any implications for RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive of the European Parliament? And do you think they'll now be looking at potentially making changes to that?
Well, there's been already one change that has been made by the Commission, which is the amount of biogas in the gas mix, and goes back to what we are producing locally is better than what we are sourcing from outside. So we have now a target of having 11% of our gas coming from biogas locally. So those things are possible. What I would say to Parliament and what I would say to you is don't rush 2030 because it's going to be very, very difficult. We are at war, and we are facing a very difficult situation. And we have to make sure that once we go through this embargo process, as I was alluding to you, Francis, earlier, we are going to see higher prices. And there is one thing we cannot do. We cannot decide an embargo, then face some gilets jaunes, and then turns back to Vladimir Putin and says, sorry, but we need the oil and the gas. So we have to really plan this in a very systemic way and to try to avoid any mistake in this. And this is not a transition for greener. This is a transition just outside energy from Russia.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bros. My name is Michael Hamper from Siemens, and I have a question regarding the increased technology coming from electrification of transportation and how this could positively impact the grid expansion or also the efficient use of our resources. So, for example, with more electric cars, more electric buses, more electric commercial trucks, one could use the battery as a mobile storage mechanism. There are pilots in California to do this. What is your view on the future of using the mobile electricity from battery in cars? Thank you.
I think it's going back to the question I had with Francis earlier. It's the prosumer, how to make sure that those people that have the electric cars, and I said high speed, it was electric car in the video, are able to use it with the system to load their battery when it's cheap and to unload when they don't need it or when the prices is high. And I think this is very important because I think it's important for two reasons. First of all, it's going to balance the grid easier. And secondly, it's a place where you can bring young engineers. And I think it's very important because we face a challenge of having young engineers going into this energy system. And I do teach in different universities. It's very difficult, but if you go and ask them to work on those elements, which are viewed as smart, and they are smart, which are viewed as modern, then you may be in a position to have bright engineers and to fast track this. So I think those elements are very important. I think the trading of CO2 is now live in Europe. I mean, we've seen in the last 2 years very smart people coming. We've seen Europe is at the forefront also of using satellite images to try to check the methane leakage all over the place. So there are places where we can really, and when I say Europe, but it's Europe or North America, where we can really put loads of new technology where young people are happy to help and to join our industries. Much more than asking them to join to produce electricity. A nuclear plant is not very popular. We will need to build, I mean, President Macron stated that he wants 6 to 14 to be built, but believe me, it's going to be a huge human resources issue when we are going to do this. I mean, we didn't do this very successfully in the last 4 nuclear plants in Europe.
All right. Well, with that, I see we've gone over our allotted time. I want to thank you, Thierry, Dr. Brosse, for taking the time to join us, particularly for taking the time to join us for the live Q&A. I think it's close to 11 p.m. where you are. But I do want to thank you for the earlier conversation as well, for providing your insights. You helped us launch our 2022 regulatory forum in style. So please join me in thanking Dr. Thierry Brosse. Thank you. And looking over here, we'll invite our first panel up to the stage. And I believe Curtis Hildebrandt is going to be moderating this panel. Come on up. All right. Thank you.
Hello there. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first panel today. Throughout the last week, we've heard a lot about the traditional regulatory framework, and it may not be up to snuff to achieve net zero goals. And so the first panel is going to look at this topic, what regulatory changes are needed to achieve net zero, and is there a need for Canadian regulations and regulators to be more risk-based and less prescriptive? So we've decided to introduce ourselves. So I'm going to begin. My name is Curtis Hildebrandt. I'm a director of regulatory reporting and strategy for ENMAX Corporation, and I'm the chair of the Electricity Canada, I've forgotten, Energy Regulation Innovation Committee, or ERIC. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sally Talberg. I am a former utility regulator in the state of Michigan and do consulting now in about 15 states in the US, working with natural gas and electric utilities on their decarbonization initiatives, and then also work with a polysilicon manufacturer that produces product that goes in solar panels and semiconductors. Pleasure to be here and just really appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Hi everyone, I'm Heather Black. I'm the public intervener for the energy sector in the province of New Brunswick, and I've had that role for 8 years. Before that, I was a lawyer in private practice, and I think I'm sort of the the token public interest person here today, so happy to be here with everyone.
My name's Jim Rossi. I'm the token academic. I'm a professor of law at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and I've worked in the utility industry for a long time. I teach energy law and am a leading author on a case book called Energy Economics and the Environment.
And do we have Indy or no? There we go.
You do. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Indy, could you please introduce yourself?
Happy to do so. I'm the token Zoom candidate. Happy to join you from Toronto. I fully expected to be in Vancouver, but for those people who know what my voice normally sounds like, even though I don't have a high alto female voice, it normally isn't this deep either. So I am rocking my best COVID. But joining you from Toronto, I am president and CEO of Alexicon Energy. It's the 4th largest municipally owned utility in Ontario, and I'm pleased to be with you today. So thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. So before we begin, we're going to define some terms, and we're going to start with you, Jim. The title of this panel is a shift to more risk-based regulation required? Can you tell us what is this risk-based regulation, and how is it different than any traditional regulation that we're familiar with?
Thanks, Kurt. And you know, in addition to teaching energy law, I teach torts. And in America, when you teach torts, you're not just teaching your students to sue Tesla or Ford Motor Company or Johnson & Johnson for the harms their products cause customers. We're also teaching them to sue PG&E, I guess. But the fundamental question tort law deals with is how we, as a society, mitigate and allocate risk. And regulation might be a much better vehicle for doing that. We're seeing that more generally in both the US and Canada these days, with the focus in securities regulation on disclosure of ESG related risks by industries. And I guess, you know, the nice thing about the question for this panel.
Hold on one second. Do you want us to take a second to let this emergency end? That could be it.
That's all.
There we go. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
So I think the beautiful thing about this question is that while we often, in American law and Canadian law too, look to the common law to deal with many questions about risk, regulation, which by its very nature is forward-looking, probably has a much better capacity to do this. So to what extent can regulation address risk, and should it do so? Let's start out by just defining risk. I view risk as being a representation of the frequency and severity of harm created by an activity. And at a general level then, if we were to have risk play a role as a guidepost in regulation, we would be focusing on risk as we make decisions about the net zero grid. The net zero grid, of course, is going to require us to recalibrate and reinvent the largest machine in the world, right? The electric power grid. It's going to require decisions by hundreds, if not thousands, of particular firms about this. And we're going to have to make investment decisions for the public. Risk gives us a guidepost for doing that. Now, at the outset, we might ask, don't we already do this in regulation? To what extent do we already take into account risk? Well, basic rate regulation and traditional utility regulation focuses primarily on cost and takes into account risk to the extent it affects costs, such as in the cost of capital. But it doesn't do a particularly good job of making decisions based on risk or in producing information in the record in rate-making proceedings, for example, based on risk. When it works well, traditional cost of service regulation might address the financial or business risks associated with building and operating the grid, with the twin goals of providing low-cost service and ensuring the utility's financial viability. But what it doesn't do is produce a lot of information about risk. It overproduces information about cost. It underproduces information for decision makers, the industry, and the public about risk. It also makes decisions based on embedded assumptions about risk. And the core idea of a shift to risk regulation would be to give us a guidepost for developing better information about risks to inform decision-making by the industry, by regulators, by the public at large about this new grid as we move forward to the net zero future. We'd have to then use that information to make basic decisions about the grid, such as who's going to bear the risk of service disruption in the net zero grid. To what extent does net zero require maybe centralized versus decentralized generation resources? To which resources and generations of customers should pay for the net zero transmission grid? All of these questions are fundamentally questions about risk, and regulation ought to be producing information and using risk as a guidepost to make some decisions about these kinds of questions. So at a minimum, I think that there's an opportunity as we move forward to net zero to put risk central to the regulatory decision-making process and use it as a guidepost and produce better information. I just want to conclude with a couple of principles that I think are really important as we have this conversation. The first is that risk is not cost. They're not the same thing. There's some overlap between cost and risk, but risk is a little bit more forward-looking with respect to an activity. It's about mitigating the severity and frequency of harm, and risk also focuses on a different set of questions about how we allocate some of those risks among different stakeholders. And finally, I think that part of what a focus on risk can do is get us to think about not just about cost, but about benefits. In some ways, the flip side of risk, which is about, again, the severity and frequency of harm, is benefit, but we have to ask harm to whom, benefit to whom. And I think risk does put the question on that bigger philosophical question of who really matters. To what extent do we care about future generations and potential harms to them? And I think part of what risk puts the focus on as well, what discount rate do we apply in the decision-making process as we think about the potential for future harms that might be created by the biggest machine in the world. With that, I'll leave some more practical questions for our other panelists. Thanks.
We're going to move to Indy next, but the question will be asked of the whole panel. But the question is, are there concrete examples of how risk is being assessed before the regulator today? Indy?
Sorry, I have to start by clearing my throat. I feel like every time I start speaking. Are there concrete examples of how risk is being approached? I mean, the Ontario Energy Board, so the regulator in Ontario, certainly approaches risk-based regulation in the terms of compliance and enforcement, looking at risk, probability, hazard, cost-benefit analysis. The OEB's approach to rate setting, PBR-based, is a form of risk-based regulation. And so they're examining the cost-benefit analyses. Even when you look at how we operate as a utility, we're looking at capital and operating planning, and that's entirely risk-based, looking at various options on how we're going to meet our distribution system needs. But I think the greater issue here is on the breadth and the assessment of the costs and benefits. And these have been expanded when you think in the current context of the issues that we are now facing, whether that's net zero, GHG reductions, and it introduces new externalities like environmental benefits, the health impacts. And in some cases, the fact is that many of these items will fall outside of the energy sector. I think that it's challenging when you consider how the regulator has to approach these things, because I would suggest it's an unprecedented predicament that the regulator is sitting in a jurisdiction where in many cases legislation and regulation support the municipal goals, the provincial goals, the federal goals, but not giving the regulator, let's call it the guardrails within which to make their decisions. So we're looking at costs and benefits, and those have been broadened not only to encompass the costs and benefits within the energy sector, but also within the economy more broadly. And so it begs the question, how does a regulator approach this, and how do they do so within the confines of their jurisdiction to make decisions given a broader level of uncertainty? We're seeing this over and over again. I mean, this is kind of the deja vu all over again of should electricity bills recover broader societal costs? Should a regulated rate of return compensate for new risks? These are important questions, but they remain unanswered. And they're probably the questions that we need to approach in the near term. And then we need to look at the cost benefit analysis. And, normally we're looking over a 5-year period, over a rate plan term. Now we're looking at broader societal and environmental impacts that are, we're buttressing against 2030 and 2050. Like, I got to tell you, I have lived, eat, breathe, slept electricity regulation for 20 plus years. I could care less what happens in 2050. 2030 is still kind of within my sights. People in the room better be laughing, because I don't think any of you care about 2050 necessarily, except from a, okay, what's going to happen in my older age perspective. But people are going to have to grapple with what's happening in 2050, but it's not the bookends that a regulator has to deal with. And when you think about even 2030, how do you deal with the risk? And normally we think about 5 years, and beyond that, we think about intergenerational inequity in rate making. So it's, I think, as much a product of how do we deal with the risk parameters, as well as how do we deal with rate setting without impugning or harming ratepayers one generation to the next, as well as how do you deal with the applicant that sits in front of you, the interveners who are advocating for customers in the context of this broader set of risk-based parameters, which are, I think, well beyond necessarily an economic regulator's mandate. So I think, yes, do they approach it? Yes. And frankly, societal issues or social issues have constantly intervened with energy-based issues, but should they, and how do you deal with the risk? I think we're at a very, I think we've often thought we were at an intersection point, but I think it's never been like this one, where the intersection point is actually based on energy. And so I think that raises up the dialogue pretty significantly.
Thanks, Cindy. Heather, would you like to go next?
Sure. Just to follow up maybe on what Indy was saying and maybe provide a little bit of a different angle. I'm a bit of a curmudgeon at times, so I'm going to maybe focus on the traditional cost of service point of view and try to think of some ways that risks that regulators are now, even in a traditional cost of service environment, assessing, mitigating, allocating risk in kind of everyday ways. And Indy was talking about PBR and cost-benefit analysis. I find that even in a cost of service environment, when a project is being considered and a cost-benefit analysis is offered by the utility, that in some circumstances, especially in the notion of avoided costs, I think there can be some really creative and nuanced ways where avoided costs are conceived of in ways that incorporate the risk of, let's say, the do-nothing alternative, which traditionally would be considered to have zero cost and zero risk. But in projects that have some connection to net zero, there's going to be, or needs to be, a growing understanding of the fact that the do-nothing alternative has a cost and has a risk. And that's, in my mind, sort of a very real, everyday place where some of these concepts have and can continue to grow to be part of an analysis, even in a traditional framework with traditional regulatory tools. Another place is the assessment of projects using a portfolio approach. where regulators do and can think of multiple projects. I mean, we heard all this week in the Campus conference about how the solution is not going to be one magic bullet. It's going to be multiple solutions over time that keep changing. And I can imagine a situation where some of these projects are evaluated with different risk profiles, different characteristics, on a portfolio basis where risk is mitigated by balancing them. So those are a couple of things that spring to mind in terms of old dusty tools that can be used in new ways. I think there are gaps. I mean, certainly traditional rate making maybe provides some disincentives that aren't helpful to these processes. And one of them that I can think of is the drive to kind of traditional infrastructure projects, traditional capital projects to drive return. Not all of the solutions will do that. Some of them will not expand rate base, which will not help keep utility investors happy. Others will reduce sales, and to the extent that the regulatory framework still couples sales and revenue, that's not going to work well for utilities. And others will require the adoption of technologies that maybe regulators aren't as comfortable with in terms of proven technologies or even proven marketability. And we're all going to have to get our heads around that a little bit more. But I do think that there are lots of everyday ways that risk is playing a part in even traditional utility regulation.
I'm Sally. This is a really interesting conversation and just such a dynamic time. And I think back of my 7.5 years on the Michigan Commission and the billions of dollars of decisions authorizing new investments in the gas and electric industry. And we were just going through major transformation of not only the distribution systems, but generation as well is happening and is so essential to move towards a net zero future. And trying to reflect on how, examples where risk was more explicitly considered. And what comes to mind immediately is integrated resource planning processes. And while not perfect, it is probably the best example where there's literally, and I never fully understood how you do stochastic risk assessment, but you're looking at risks such as extreme weather and different conditions that can affect the operations of the system. You're looking at different fuel and other variables that could affect the potential obsolescence of technology and avoidance of future stranded costs where things change. You've approved something, billion-dollar investment that no longer can serve its intended use. And so I think that while that needs to continue to evolve and is evolving. There's a lot more sophisticated modeling techniques that are being used. I think there's a lot more that can be done in that regard with respect to the operational side with extreme weather. We have, at least in the US, it still seems pretty crude in terms of how we're planning for resource adequacy, given how dynamic the system, that the events that are happening are not necessarily the summer peak that you're planning for, and that isn't necessarily the best proxy for accounting for both the variability in weather, and particularly with the move towards electrification of buildings and transportation sectors. We're not only changing the biggest machine in the world, but the demand side of it is changing simultaneously. And so inherent in that is just a lot of risk. So the other piece, and this is also in the planning realm, I would say distribution system planning is becoming increasingly more transparent and also taking more explicit consideration of risks. And again, with so much, instead of the distribution system just being this road to get to the customer, it's now becoming the highway. And trying to plan for that with, customers exporting, generation back onto the grid, I think that, you're also seeing the planning models and a lot of innovation that utilities are doing around the distribution system. So I think it's exciting. I try to guide my decisions, even though, the statute talked about cost and reliability. It's pretty broad in terms of like the rate making authority. And, I always think of like this accounting whiz on the staff, and just remember, like, thinking about the value that those investments, it may not be the least cost, but is it providing the value? And maybe that gets to the cost benefit. That's a more explicit way to try and assess that. And also thinking long term. I mean, when you're a regulator and you are seeing what's in a utility bill from a decision made 40 years previous to you, you start to think about the effect you will have on future ratepayers. And it may not be 2050, but it probably is 2040, because I mean, just the sheer magnitude of these investments are so significant that you really, it's so essential to think holistically and account for the risk.
Thank you. The next question will start with Indy, and then I'll open it to the panel, whoever would like to answer. Many electric utilities are taking the position that they need to have clearer regulatory direction and the ability to invest in infrastructure needed to meet net zero targets. Do you think that the current regulatory framework is preventing electric utilities from making these investments? Indy?
Thanks so much, Curtis. I think it's I hope my regulator friends are about to appreciate what I'm going to say, but I think it's unfair to park this just at the regulator's doorstep. I don't think it's just about the regulatory framework. I think that in this instance, it's not just about the regulatory framework that's hindering efforts, but there's overall political uncertainty. I mean, let's be real. And I said this during Camput earlier this week, like, net zero is the new thing. A year and a half ago, like at least before COP in Scotland, nobody was talking about net zero anything. So this is totally a 2021 net zero everything is the new catchphrase. And it's certainly the direction in which we're going. And sorry, I don't mean to downplay it. It is the right way to go. It is certainly what we need from a globe perspective, from a humanity perspective, from a if we want to live on this planet perspective. However, it's new, like it is brand new. So to say that it's the regulatory framework that's holding us back is entirely unfair, because the regulators work in the confines of what their mandate is. And so there's an overarching political aspect to this. And there needs to be the political will that then imposes on regulators, creates regulatory policy. And so in the absence of, I'll say, capital P policy, legislation and regulation, how does a regulator actually affect this? And so and then the other thing is, and I think I kind of touched on this in my response to the very first question, that many of these decisions have broader economic implications than those that are limited to whether it's electricity or natural gas regulation. And they're arguably well outside an economic regulator's jurisdiction. So I think you need to start with, and it's fair to say that from a regulator's standpoint, it needs to be about what's hitting the regulators. So what's within the regulator's mandate. Now, the OEB in Ontario has both natural gas and electricity. So what's hitting both electricity and natural gas bills in the context of our conversation? What's hitting the electricity bill? Now, if you step through that, then the real question is, should regulators be put in a position with dealing with issues that are best left to those who we elect into office? And then how can those frameworks be better developed to support the regulatory framework? So I feel like there's a trickle down effect, and there's also an order of operation here, because this is part of a broader picture. But the bigger issue then is that, at least from where I sit, I have 5 municipal shareholders. And so each of my municipal shareholders have declared net zero targets. So as a key contributor to their economy and to economic development in the service areas that I serve, I need to support their net zero targets. At the same time, I have a funding envelope that is dictated by the Ontario Energy Board. So there is a natural confluence of how both the politics of this and the economics of this need to come to a head. But the greater implication here, I think more so than ever before, is that it's three, at least in Canada, at least in Ontario, at least for my service area, it's now 3 levels of government. The federal government has put out targets. The provincial government hasn't yet put out targets, but hey, we have the writ drop, so I am sure we're going to hear all kinds of chatter about what those provincial targets are going to be. And then I have municipal targets, and then I have a regulator. And so it's a very interesting dance when you're the electricity distribution company who also needs to serve customers and contribute to achieving the targets. So I can't park this at the regulator's doorstep at all, because I think there is a natural and necessary discussion that needs to happen that involves many stakeholders and is both big P politics and small p politics all at the same time.
Thanks, Indy. Who would like to go next? Heather?
I'll just follow up from what Indy was saying. And I would address you directly, Indy, but your face disappears every time I start to talk, so I keep talking about you in the third person.
I'm right here.
I completely agree with this notion of it being sort of an unfair characterization to say, okay, the real barrier here is the regulator thinking small or thinking old-fashioned or creating these barriers, because I'm firmly in the camp that believes that the regulator can only do what the legislation allows the regulator to do. That is the entire ethos of an administrative tribunal. Beyond that, it is very difficult, I think, to expect today, in this sort of infancy of net zero, to expect, even if the political will crystallize, to create not only targets and plans to make plans and plans to make laws, but real laws that a utility could point to and say, I need to be compliant with this, and the regulator could point to and say, they need to be compliant with this, and this is what it will cost, and this is the standard. In a world where that is absent, it's difficult to do, and it's also difficult to do in any way that we can consider durable. If I don't want to be provocative here, but if we've learned anything over the last couple of months in North American history, it's that basic legal advances that have seemingly been absolutely unable to be toppled are now being threatened and toppled. And we shouldn't assume that even if some of these targets turn into laws in 2 years, 3 years, that it's not all going to change again in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in certain jurisdictions. So it makes it challenging, even at a political level, to create anything that's crystallized. And that makes it almost very difficult for the regulator to have any certainty and provide that certainty to utilities and customers. That said, obviously that's sort of the holy grail, because not only would the clear law and clear policy, to the extent it's possible to do so, provide the regulator with the certainty it needs to then pass that on to its decisions to utilities and to ratepayers, but also to sort of the broader investment community, so they know where to put their capital and what solutions can be invented and pursued that will follow along those lines in a way that's stable. And then just naturally, I would expect that costs would go down on some of these investments or some of these solutions, and risk would go down, and that would assist the whole circle in terms of affordability, reliability, climate goals, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess all of that to say, nothing more than what was in the premise of the question, which is, do we need regulatory certainty? Yes, but it's very hard to fault the regulator for not providing it, because I don't know that it's theirs to provide.
I would just add, I mean, there's different styles of regulation. I mean, in some cases, much more like a judge and responding to what industry presents. Other jurisdictions have a more proactive approach in terms of identifying what the barriers are and then convening stakeholders to try and figure out solutions to those, which may include changes in laws or regulations, and doing that more proactively. And, you know, I may be jaded, but, you know, counting on, you know, policymakers to actually bring about the change that's needed in order to address climate change in a timely manner, in an orderly manner. You know, what I've seen more often is actually the industry driving this because of the inherent business risks involved that are just only increasing. And I think, you know, can kind of lead the way. And I think of regulation as like this puzzle, and you're trying to put these pieces together with the framework that you have, and sometimes you have missing pieces, and you can go and try and fill those voids, or, you know, work around the puzzle and make it still work even with some missing pieces. But I really think it's not necessarily the move to net zero, but it's the sheer scale of investments that are needed and the pace of change that is really at odds with the regulatory model that is by design somewhat slow, the due process involved, which is absolutely critical, but it is a challenge. And so I think without a doubt, you know, there's just the need for continued innovation in how regulation is done, and an openness to change practices. And I think if anything, COVID was instrumental in getting, you know, regulatory bodies to think differently, how to operate differently, and realize that they could bring about changes. And I think that can also carry over. I mean, that was more operationally, but even carry over into, you know, approaches to think differently about the regulatory model.
Could I just mention, I think the point about, you know, industry driving a lot of this and business practice driving this is a very important one. COVID's a good example about how, you know, the risks of virus transmission changing so many of our social practices. But just looking at the utility industry and thinking of some of the issues that have come up with extreme weather and insurance and the availability of information today about risk in this context and how that's influencing business decision making, it's inevitable that that information is going to be coming up in future rate making proceedings, and regulators will have broad discretion to take that information into account as they decide things like just and reasonable rates or the public interest, because, you know, the regulatory mandate is so expansive. I think the opportunity to develop the record and the information today is increasingly going to be available to various stakeholders in the regulatory process. It's available in industry decision making. In the future, it's inevitably going to be available in financial markets as well with ESG disclosure. We're going to have quantitative measures of risk that will be developed in the industry that we can use now to compare apples and apples across firms. And that's a big change in business practice and decision making, and it's inevitably going to play an evidentiary role in the future in the regulatory process, even if the law itself doesn't change.
Perfect. I've got one last question, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. The utility industry faces issues all the time. For instance, utilities have invested in cybersecurity over the last few years, and no changes were required to the regulatory framework. So what makes net zero so special? Why is it different than anything else like cybersecurity investments? And would you like to start, Heather, and then we'll open it up?
Sure. It's kind of an interesting question in terms of the different regulatory treatment of those two issues, at least the way sort of I would attack it if I'm reviewing an application. And I think they're very different issues, even though in some ways they kind of seem the same at first blush, because they're both issues that are always growing, always changing, and kind of large enough and out of control enough to cause sort of an existential threat. But I think net zero is very different in that cybersecurity, you can reach to a set of standards that exist, that are well understood and well accepted in order to start addressing it, even if you do have to throw untold amounts of money at the problem. At least there's a path forward that everybody understands. The second big difference is, it's a bit of a pop psychology difference, I guess, but the consequences of inaction for net zero are not immediate and are not, maybe not well accepted, but I'll just say not immediate. So what I'll say is that it kind of goes back to this idea of the do-nothing alternative. If I'm considering an investment in cybersecurity, I know what the do-nothing alternative is. There might not be an attack on whatever the system is immediately, but I understand the potential for that. And I also understand the tools that are needed to at least make best efforts to prevent it. With net zero, it's awfully tempting without deliberate and thoughtful changes in the way that I would approach it. It's awfully tempting to say, yeah, but it costs too much and that's far off in the future. So I think what's needed with net zero is this kind of deliberate, almost creation of a sense of immediacy and urgency to characterize the risk in a way that will translate into regulatory decisions. Because I think that's sort of naturally there with cybersecurity.
Would you like to go to Indy next and then Jim?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Thanks, Curtis. I think that there's a fundamental difference between net zero and cybersecurity. I mean, the fact is that, when the issue of cybersecurity first arose, we likely as a sector weren't doing much. Frankly, I think most energy utilities have been leveling up on IT over the past couple of decades. And so, you find yourself in 2018 thinking that you're in 2012, you find yourself in 2022 feeling like you're in 2018. We've been moving along the IT trajectory as we go. But when it comes to cybersecurity, the reason why I don't think we needed any regulatory framework changes was because it was entirely within the mandate of the regulator. What's the risk of a cybersecurity attack? Nobody cares. I would hazard to guess that nobody cares about my customers' billing addresses. I think everybody cares about the OT aspects of my system. And when I think of where we sit today on May the 4th be with you, in fact, everybody, but as we sit here on May 4th, with a war in Ukraine, and we think about the nefarious actors on the other side of the world, where are they going to attack in Canada, the United States, North America, more globally? It's on our distribution system. So are they going to attack our SCADA system? So is it the OT pieces? Absolutely. So is that tied to what the regulator should be responsible for? 100%. Because it is about the security of the distribution system. It's the security of the grid. When you think about net zero, I think it's 100% different because the benefits, the costs as well, reach well beyond, and this kind of harkens back to the remarks I made earlier, it reaches well beyond the energy sector itself. And so when it involves economy-wide considerations, I think it's an opportunity to pause, and it certainly has greater implications that are well beyond, again, like I said before, well beyond the scope of an economic regulator. Now, Do I think that there isn't an aspect that is relevant to our regulators? 100% I do. But the fact is that there's a massive impact on the system of meeting customers or, municipalities, cities' net zero targets, distributed energy resources, EV, fuel switching, DER, and it introduces various different cost benefit analyses that have broader, both environmental and economic benefits. So, when we consider in Ontario what this is going to look like, I think the notion is that we'll have to double the size of our electricity system to facilitate fuel switching associated with decarbonization goals. Is that all in the purview of the Ontario Energy Board? I'm sure they're like, please no, please stop. But the line between what is contestable or what's subject to competition versus what is regulated becomes even more blurred than it was ever before. And it was blurred when we were talking 2 or 3 years ago about distributed energy resources. Now you layer on net zero and it becomes a whole different conversation. So I think that it's entirely different when you compare cybersecurity, which has real implications to the distribution system, versus net zero that goes well beyond it and what's within, or what should be within, the needs of the regulator.
All right, I'm going to jump in, and then you jump. Okay. I think, so just really briefly, what Heather said about, I kept going back and forth. Are they the same? Are they really different? That the immediacy of the impact on your particular customers associated with cybersecurity and preventing that, and the accountability that comes with that, whether it's the regulator or the industry leadership, is pretty profound and drives a lot of action. That was always my biggest fear, that we were going to have some major cyber event and it would shut down the grid. And knowing how essential electricity and natural gas are to human life and our economy, it's terrifying. With climate change, and I think this is changing as we're seeing more and more evidence and more scientific research, that this is upon us and it's happening all over the place in terms of the actual effects. And so while, actions of one utility may be completely surpassed by a country across the globe, and the effects of that would be also felt somewhere else potentially, but I think more and more we're seeing, just think about what happened here in this magical place called British Columbia. You had landslides, you had I can't put it in Celsius, but it was very, very hot, and life-threatening temperatures here in the Pacific Northwest. There were fires. There were, what else happened? There was flooding. We're seeing extreme cold events other places. It's just happening more and more. And so I think that starts to change sort of the mindset in terms of collectively, we all need to do our part to bring about change.
I see them as fundamentally different problems. I think climate change is what engineers would call a wicked problem due to its size, scale, and all the unknowns. With cybersecurity, at any given point in time, with respect to the existing physical infrastructure, there are some accepted practices for managing it. So the scale of the problem is very different. And the point about discounting future harms is also important, right? Any of us can be harmed right now by cybersecurity breaches, but most of us are not harmed immediately today by climate change. And in fact, the harm for climate change may not materialize for generations into the future in terms of injury or harm. So I think they're fundamentally different in that regard. But still, in regulation, I think we need to make trade-offs about scarce resources and decide where to invest. And we could invest all our resources in addressing solvable problems today that are immediate, like cybersecurity risks. And at some point, we have to decide when to allocate resources to other kinds of potential harms. And part of what I think tangible information about risks can do is it can give regulators some information that can be helpful in making those trade-offs. So when they think about the harms associated with catastrophic events, very small probability events, but then we need to have that data on the gravity of the harm and data on the cost associated. There's that information out there that we can take into account now as we decide, how we're going to allocate scarce resources regarding the management of the grid. Because I think we're better off with that information and with explicit information like that being taken into account as we make trade-offs about risk regulation than we would be if we just ignored it.
Okay. Just before we move on, just one small point. I just find it very interesting. You mentioned a few times the value of the data, and I think that's a point I wanted to mention. We talk a lot about the legislative constraints on the regulator, but there's also, from the bottom up, the regulator can only use the evidence that's before it and to make decisions. And of course, the regulator can sort of influence and instruct in terms of the issues that need to be addressed in a particular proceeding. But I think there's lots of value in the utilities bringing some of that data to bear in their applications, and then it's a matter of the regulator being open to considering it, and the interveners being open to testing it and providing a really robust record so that the regulator can make decisions with those considerations in mind.
Perfect. I think we can open it up for questions now, and I think there's one up front. If you can get a microphone. There we go.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yeah. So Teresa McClanahan, Canadian Environmental Law Association and the Low Income Energy Network. And some of you mentioned intergenerational equity. And also, Indy, you mentioned 2050 is so far away, which I agree, I have that sense too. But I did something I've never done before and figured out how old my kids will be in 2050. And so interestingly, that's 28 years from now, and my oldest was born 28 years ago. So my 4 kids will be between 48 and 58 years of age in 2050. So this is not actually, as I think I tend to think, way off in the future. I feel like 1993, 28 years ago, was like just yesterday. So, all of you who are saying time is on us, like when we talk about the 2030 or the 2035 or the 2040 goals, 2052 is right up there. So my question on intergenerational equity is, what risks are we shifting to our kids apart from the climate risks as a result of status quo regulation? So for example, what financial risks, what in terms of availability of services, or even how energy services themselves can protect from climate risks in the future, like that big UN report that heat deaths are one of the big risks for the future. I'm just wanting to take a step back for us to think about why it is the do nothing is really not viable. And I'm wondering if you can be really specific with your knowledge of the regulatory systems and the decisions that are being made about what risks we are de facto shifting to our kids, the way we're doing things right now.
Well, I mean, a couple things come to mind. Just on the power supply side, and I don't know if this is the situation, you are blessed with a lot of hydro assets that are going to continue to provide a lot of value, but with the closures of coal plants, many of those, I came in thinking this plant was built in 1950. Why, surely it's fully depreciated, right? No, it's not. It's billions and billions of dollars of stranded costs for the assets that are being retired. And then, then you're making decisions about how do I replace those assets. And with the nature and timing of technology, and you make the best decisions that you can with the information you have at that time. But I would not be surprised if we have other assets that become, and maybe their intended use changes. For example, a combined cycle gas turbine that is, it's there, it can backstop, reliability in a heavily industrialized area where you've got a lot of coal retirements. but is it really going to be a baseload unit in 2032, with the $1 billion invested into it, or does it become a peaker because of the emissions associated with that? And so, there's other new technologies that can play a vital role in terms of balancing the system, long duration storage, hydrogen, other, but they're, somewhat untested. And so there's not only the risk of, obsolescence of technology and the costs that go with that, but also cost overruns that could occur, with new investments. So it's it's interesting times.
Another example would be gas pipelines and gas pipeline infrastructure. What will happen to that?
Yeah.
Will that be decommissioned, and who will bear the costs of it? With respect to future generations, I can only speak to the American regulatory process, but the embedded practice is to, first of all, determine rate base or cost for a purpose, and then secondly, once we've done that, think about how we allocate that cost. And in some ways, I think that has it backwards, and there might be some advantage to putting some of those fundamental questions up front, or having regulatory proceedings or guidance to inform regulatory decisions about those bigger questions of allocation across different customers and across generations at the outset. And I think these questions are really fundamental as we think about electricity in the future, because if we don't have those discussions at the outset, the fear would be that we embed our grandparents' sense of risk regarding the grid and electricity into the future. And I don't know if that always makes sense. Notions of reliability are going to change, and it's inevitable that they will change as we think about the grid of the future.
Heather or Indy, would you like the last word?
I guess I'll just say, just sort of at a high level, that this is kind of a place that's ripe for clarity of law and policy, because I think if there is legislation that breaks down some of these larger goals into bite-sized pieces that regulators and the regulated can point to and say, we have to do X, then it takes some of the, I keep using the word temptation, but that's not what I really mean. It takes some of the decision-making around where to allocate decisions over time away from the process when there's so many other pressures in terms of costs and affordability.
It's good news we've been given a few more minutes to answer one more question. Is there one over there? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Hamper from Siemens, and I would like to challenge all of us and maybe think out of the box. So we learned from Dr. Bros that we are in a perfect storm. We are in times of transformation. Digitalization is happening. Technology advancements are everywhere, and I think there's a bit of overwhelmment at regulators and also utilities. So we need to maintain just and reasonable rates, affordability, risk-based approach. But what if we had a learning regulation? So at the OEB in Ontario, for example, there is the concept of a regulatory sandbox, which allows space for regulation. This is, by the way, also what the European Union does. So in times where you have sector coupling, you have e-car innovation, you have demand response topics, I think we need to allow space for the utility to invest, to innovate, and not right away use the term risk-based, but learning regulation. And I think the OEB has a fantastic example of the regulatory sandbox, which on the one hand maintains the regulatory oversight, but allows space for the industry to grow. So I wanted to just ask the panel to comment on this topic of regulatory sandbox and a learning regulation. Thank you.
Given that you're from Ontario, Indy, would you like to take the first crack at this one?
I'm shocked that you came to me first. I have, both in my past life, in my previous role at my previous organization, as well as currently, been exploring opportunities through the regulatory sandbox. I would agree with the person who posed the question. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. That it is a tremendous opportunity to have candid discussions with senior OEB staff, in my case, on opportunities and to further explore risks through those candid conversations, and then to also explore opportunities where there may be a potential to relax a regulation that is relax a code that is within the OEB's mandate in order to explore a new opportunity. Certainly, I've done that previously, certainly undertaking that now. The challenge, I'm not saying anything that my friends from the OEB who are in the room won't know that I've already said to them directly. The challenge with the sandbox is that often when you come forward as an applicant exploring particular opportunities, sometimes it's the case that all you need is the relaxing of a code for a period of time in order to explore an opportunity. More often, it's that you also need funding to go along with it. And so the challenge with the sandbox is that there isn't funding in the sandbox. And, don't get me wrong, OEB staff are very upfront about you still need to make the appropriate rate application and seek the relief that you need to seek. That being said, the opportunity, and especially with and I don't know how many people are aware in the room, but the OEB recently revised its sandbox. So let's call it Sandbox 2.0. So there's a sandbox application process as well as then a rate making process that can follow. So it's interesting to see how applicants such as myself will bring forward applications not only through the sandbox, but to future rate making in order to bring the two items together, the exploration and then the relaxing of regulation, and then the rate making that funds it in order to then do exactly what the questioner has asked, which is like an exploratory or an educational rate making. My goal when I approach the OEB through the sandbox is that we're trying to get beyond, and my organization, as well as my predecessors, have been pretty adept at doing the science projects, the pilot project, 20 homes, 70 homes, 25 homes, whatever. But we need to get bigger and better and beyond that, because you otherwise don't have the threshold of making something more broadly viable. So I'm hoping that in going through Sandbox 2.0 and the rate relief that goes along with it, that myself as well as other utilities in Ontario are able to leverage exactly that, seeking out educational opportunities, being able to share the outcomes with others so that there is a more broad, so that there's a broader base and a greater uptake of those opportunities. But I think we're kind of trudging down that path now.
All right. Would any of you like the last word?
I really like the idea of the regulatory sandbox and experimentation, and there might be opportunities to combine it with rate making. There might also be opportunities to combine it with risk regulation. If a utility can show a certain risk profile, for example, with respect to weatherization and the like, why not let it play in the sandbox for a period of time? So, as long as you comply with some basic performance-oriented rules, the sandbox would be the forum for making regulatory decisions. But otherwise, you have to go build your sandcastle on the beach, and it'll get washed away.
All right, I think that's a perfect way to end the panel. Can everyone please help me thank the panel for coming today and speaking?
Okay, thank you very much, Curtis and panel, for a very interesting conversation. Really appreciate it. Là, nous allons prendre une pause d'une quinzaine de minutes. We're going to hit our break now for 15 minutes, and we will reconvene here in 15 minutes' time. Once again, thank you very much, panel.
All right, so we'll get going. I'll introduce myself first, and then the panel members and our topic. So, final panel for today, and want to thank panel one. I think they set us up well. Our panel topic today is the regulator's role in navigating the three political levels of government. And the way I would set up the question that these panel members are going to try to speak to is a very simple question of, we've talked a lot about what the barriers are. We've talked a lot about the noise and the uncertainty that exists. But at the end of the day, should regulators act or should they wait? Act or wait? That's what this panel is going to talk to in a broad sense, but we'll obviously delve into a number of different pieces of that. But to start off by introducing myself and the panel, my name is Chris Samvey. I'm the Chief Regulatory Officer at BC Hydro. And one thing I've learned about my fellow panel members is that they are very opinionated. So to cut to the chase and get them sharing their opinions, they wanted me to introduce them so we can just get right to it. So right to my left here is Kristen Van den Bos, who's an associate professor at the University of Calgary. We then have Mark Colasar, who is former chair of the Alberta Utilities Commission, now with Colasar, Buchanan and Associates. We have Jason Dion, Mitigation Research Director with the Canadian Climate Institute. And we have Liza Reed, Research Manager, Low Carbon Technology Policy with the Niskanen Center. And finally, joining us virtually, we have Dave Nicolishin, Strategic Advisory with McCarthy Tetro, and also a former Deputy Minister with the BC government. So diving in, what I thought we would do to start is, as I say, we kind of talk a lot about how things are working, what the to and fro is, barriers, etc. Wanted to start with you, Kristen, just kind of at a high level on how things should work. So can you just talk a little bit about what we can be expecting to see in the electricity industry from utilities as we move towards net zero, what regulators might see come before them, and in an ideal world, how should that all work in terms of what government would set up for regulators and how that would, all those pieces would come together?
Oh, thank you, Chris. And I'm thrilled to be here, by the way, even though this is the 1 week out of every year where Calgary has better weather than Vancouver. So in an ideal world, I think many of you probably already know this, but so the federal government makes federal policy for the entire country. The provinces make laws and policies that apply to their own areas of provincial power, which traditionally in Canada does include electricity. Whether it should only be with the provinces to regulate electricity, I think, is another question that I could easily talk about, especially if you buy me a drink for a very long period of time. But the way that it works now is that electricity policy comes from the provinces. So we do get direction from the federal government in the form of things like net zero by 2050 and the emissions reduction plan, which do include the electricity sectors. But ultimately, the regulators are working for the provinces, and generally we think of regulators as being compliance insurers. So primarily what they're doing is they are following the directions that they get from the province, which usually emphasize things like just and reasonable rates, safe and reliable power, and then leave quite a bit of discretion up to the regulator. It depends. Some regulations will include specific directions to use, for example, the creation of the rate-based and cost of service rate making. Sometimes they don't. But for the most part, the regulators have a wide amount of discretion. But they also understand that they are kind of working to carry out the wishes of the province. So in a perfect world, the province will tell the regulator what they want. What actually happens a lot of the time is that the province isn't necessarily noticing what the regulator is doing unless something begins to happen that is having a negative political impact on the province. It's causing the rates to rise for people and they are getting upset about it. So a lot of times the regulators are working without a lot of input from the province unless they do something that the province doesn't like. But ideally we would see the provinces give specific directions to the regulators what they would like to see and how to accomplish it. But in reality, what we see is that the regulators are actually doing a lot of the work using their own best sort of best efforts to achieve what they believe the province wants them to do, which is to ensure just and reasonable rates and have safe and reliable power. And so I will sort of stop talking there, because I guess that would be sort of the ideal situation. But I would say, I think one of the things that maybe will come out a bit in this panel too is that even though it might be frustrating for regulators sometimes that they don't get the kind of specific direction from the provinces they would like, therein could lie an opportunity for regulators to be more proactive with the discretion they have.
So maybe I'll get you to jump in here, Liza, both in terms of just how you've seen things work in the United States, or how things could work in the United States, but also maybe picking up on something Kristen said, tell the regulator what you want. Any thoughts you might have on how that could work, should work, what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kristen, for that overview. Giving a little perspective on the U.S., there's a really interesting fundamental difference in how U.S. electricity is regulated versus Canada. We do not have a national climate policy, right? Where Canada has my understanding is there is a carbon policy, although it is individually interpreted at all the provinces. We don't have a carbon policy, we don't have a carbon tax, we don't have cap and trade, but we do have a federal authority. We do have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. However, they have a very limited authority over electricity transmission. That authority was changed in November. How many months is that? 6 months ago? 5 months ago? So I could talk about that for hours, about what that might mean, but we don't have an answer on what it's going to mean. So there's been broad guidance from FERC over the past 10 and 20 years on things like planning, on things like coordination between regions and between states. So some of that effort has happened, but at the end of the day, it also does still fall on the states to decide where the lines are going and what lines are getting approved. So there's a lot of similarities and differences, and from what I understand, we end up running into the same challenges, which is how do you reach these targets, and how do you reach these targets together? It's certainly the case in the United States. There is not a study that exists that says states can reach these targets on their own, and so that's going to require collaboration, but with nobody setting the rules of collaboration, we've got kids on the playground all trying to decide what game they're playing, let alone sort of what the rules are. So I think we share a lot of commonalities and tension there between Canada and the US. What ends up happening in the US, to lean into some of this, what's happening in reality, is it is very state-led in the end. So we do have states with very aggressive climate targets. So New York is one of them, California is one of them. And New York and California are really interesting because all of their levels of regulation are state contained. So we don't have the utilities are all regulated by the state, the ISO, which is a independent system operator, which I know crosses over in most areas of Canada, I don't know if it's all of it, is all contained within New York, is all contained within California. So it's a little bit easier to do some of this planning and execution and make sure that it happens. It's a little harder in places like Massachusetts. So I'll tell a brief story and then we can get back to discussion here. A bit of a nightmare story about reaching clean energy targets. Massachusetts has had a clean energy target for quite a while and has been trying to achieve this clean energy target through procuring clean electricity through transmission lines, primarily from Hydro-Quebec. And the first time they went with a contractor who proposed a line through New Hampshire. New Hampshire said, absolutely not. You don't get to build a transmission line that looks like that to give clean energy to yourself. That was about 5 years ago that they said no. Massachusetts went with another contractor through Maine. And in Maine, the state regulators approved the line and agreed that this was going to be bringing low-cost clean energy to Maine. And the Republican governor approved the line. When the politics changed and there was a Democratic governor, the Democratic governor approved the line. Feels like a feel-good story. It was rejected at the ballot box by voters in November. So now the line has been being built. It was approved by everybody. It was under construction when it was rejected retroactively by voters. And one of the reasons I tell this story is because the politics are so interesting here. It was ostensibly an environmental vote, a NIMBY issue, that we don't want to cut through some Maine wildlife. But it was primarily funded by incumbent utilities. So I don't know what we call that, NINSIM, not in my captive market. But there's a different issue at play here than just sort of people on the ground, right? There are incumbent interests who are in competition with these net zero targets.
So maybe picking up on that last point, with these interests that we've got, also we talked about before, where we don't necessarily always have clear direction for levels of government. Maybe Jason, if you can just talk a bit about what discretion do regulators actually have if they want to act, if they want to move. What are the boundaries? What do they got to work with today?
So I think this question is best answered specifically by regulators themselves in terms of what it looks like uniquely across the country. But as we look across the country, I mean, I think you can generalize to say that the mandates as they connect to net zero and climate change are usually unstated or ambiguous. And the first question to ask is, well, is that a problem? Because there are people in my world in climate policy who would say, okay, well, you can just sort of bring in stronger climate policy, lay out a trajectory, and the job of regulators can stay the same. It's just now you operate within that constraint. The challenge is regulators and utilities are making decisions that have decades-long implications. And we have, solid climate policy trajectory in the form of carbon pricing to 2030, but beyond it remains a bit unclear. So this disconnect between existing climate policies and our long-term ambitions puts regulators in a difficult position. And so is a clarifying mandate necessary? Our view would be yes, but it's also not enough, right? Because if you sort of mandate that, it becomes an open-ended request. Well, figure out what you're going to do to connect those existing policies to long-term targets. Not only are regulators not in a great position to sort of make that determination, as Mark has pointed out before, in fact, you open up their decisions to being overturned in litigation when you don't give them a defensible basis to make those decisions according to. So our view is that you need mandates for regulators, but you also need to give them the resources and tools they need to make informed and defensible decisions. Things like comprehensive energy plans from provincial governments that are non-binding and informational, but set some parameters around what the future is supposed to look like, as well as regular independent pathway assessments. These are the things we really need to operationalize a mandate around net zero. And not to say the work can't be done without it, but we risk spinning our wheels and going slower and being less successful if we don't do these things.
So Dave, maybe I'll get you to jump in here. Jason mentioned a couple things. He mentioned, lack of mandates. It's ambiguous. It's high level. There's things governments can do, like energy plans, to try and bring in some more specificity. But maybe if you could just talk a bit about, from your perspective, how governments fit into this, and how constrained are regulators when governments may have filled in, some of the picture, maybe they've filled in a fair bit, maybe they're just kind of sitting back and not really giving an indication of what the political will is. How does the regulator step into that? What kind of challenges do you see them facing?
Sure, thanks, Chris. And I'll try to answer the question by coming at it in a couple of different ways. So, one way to look at it is, and again, I'll talk about BC mostly because that's the domain I know, but I think it's transferable. What tools do the regulators have at their disposal today? Like, are they actually constrained, or do they just perceive themselves to be? And, I look at the number one tool that I think the Utilities Commission has at their disposal is, the integrated resource planning process, which is not always proceeded, seamlessly, but I think that tool set, and certainly the regulator has the ability to issue orders to frame that process and how it will be conducted and which things to focus on and so on. I think the regulator could find the authority to issue assertive orders in that space in statutes like the Clean Energy Act, which certainly contemplate, conservation and climate and renewables, and in fact has GHG reduction targets legislated in to the statute itself. And so, those authorities are ostensibly there. The challenge for the regulators is, also in the Clean Energy Act, is things like, attention to rates and competitiveness and those kinds of things. And that tends to be where the balance has tipped. Another way to look at the question is, well, what authorities do the regulators certainly have today that are indisputable and broad and not controversial? And those are relatively easy, like looking at the load forecasts and the planning around that, how to do capacity planning and energy planning, and how to meet those forecasts with some combination of DSM and building new generation and the prudence of investments. And all of those things kind of culminate again in that job that the regulator has around rates and competitiveness, and making sure as job one that the system is reliable and affordable. So when you layer on things like net zero, first of all, net zero isn't in things like the Clean Energy Act because it's a relatively new concept, but conceptually it's been there. But when you layer in net zero, you start to drift into debatable things that are much more, well, debatable, quite frankly, like, you know, the whole domain of climate change and how fast it's happening and to what extent and what to do about it. You know, some technical things like how many electric cars by when, how fast is industry going to electrify? Should we have, you know, incentives for things in rates, or, you know, even more interesting, should we punish, you know, dirty industries that don't comply with our idea of how to get to net zero? So those start to get pretty edgy pretty fast. And I can tell you, you know, as a deputy minister of energy for many, many years in British Columbia, I served different governments of different stripe with many different energy ministers. And I would say across the board, they all would have taken a dim view of regulators, you know, getting into what they would consider their turf as policymakers. I think Jason was right, though. You know, there's a distinction there to be drawn. But well, then, you know, should the ministers and policymakers be doing a better job of articulating what they want and to allow the utility and regulators to help them get there? For sure. But I'll tell you, the regulators as policymakers is a pretty tricky spot to be in.
Maybe I'll just pick off a piece of something you said there, Dave, and just see if anyone on the panel wants to jump in on this. One of the challenges I think you were kind of getting at there was this idea that, you know, regulators and the expectation to do everything, you know, keep rates affordable, keep the system reliable, but do net zero and make sure we've got resilience and so on and so forth. And so any thoughts from the panel on you know, when this is kind of an added expectation, the other stuff's not going away, how regulators kind of navigate through that myriad of issues? Anyone that wants to jump in?
Well, I'm probably the obvious choice. Certainly, it's going to add to workload, and one of the challenges that any regulator has is to decide, like, where does my focus have to go? And what we're seeing is an environment where I think the focus not so much has to shift, but the focus has to broaden out. So if we look at the recent history of regulation, at least utility regulation, it's really been increasingly focused on trying to encourage greater efficiency in the utilities. And that's fine, and I think that's an important part of the mix, but increasingly that focus has to start shifting to trying to have an orderly transition in the utility marketplace, because the utility marketplace is changing. The pace of change is going up significantly. And although we talk about net zero, it's kind of a broad concept. What is actually happening is significant shifts in the market that are being driven by societal expectations and technological change. And that is putting tremendous pressure on utilities to come up with a new business model. The traditional end-to-end monopoly from generation to delivery is gradually starting to break down. And right now, for the most part, all around the edges. But as that breakdown begins to increase, the challenge that regulators are going to have is, how do I manage an orderly transition in a market where the dynamics of the market are significantly changing? And oddly enough, it's net zero, or the desire for net zero, that's driving a lot of that change, a lot of the technological change, and a lot of the societal expectations and consumer expectations are really wrapped up in the desire to achieve net zero, or the desire to achieve those types of targets without necessarily voicing specifically what they are. So it's going to be a huge task for any regulator to continue with the more traditional mandate while at the same time turning their focus on how do we have a more orderly transition of the utility space. So it ain't going to be easy.
All right, so maybe to layer on further challenges and make it sound even more difficult, I'll go to you, Kristen. We've talked a bit about, Dave mentioned not having worked for a minister that would get super excited if regulators started to push into what they would see as a policy domain. But can you speak at all to the court side of this? Do regulators face a barrier potentially from the courts if they begin to act?
Well, it is true that there is a relationship between the regulators and the courts, and ordinarily the way that it works is that provincial regulators, there are appeals from decisions, final decisions of regulators that can be made, usually to the Provincial Court of Appeal, and in limited cases, judicial review to usually the trial court, so in Alberta that's the Court of Queen's Bench. And then for the CER, decisions are appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal. And in the past, it was called the Dunsmuir Standard. It was named not after the street here in Vancouver, but after a case called Dunsmuir that sort of set out a pretty high degree of deference. So essentially saying, the courts would say, well, I get a final decision from a regulator, and the decision is made by experts. And we as a court, we don't necessarily have the same kind of understanding of these issues that they do, and so we will accord them a pretty high degree of deference. So that translates into what's called the standard of review. And the standard of review previously under the Dunsmuir sort of baseline was reasonableness. And reasonableness, as you can imagine, is a pretty relaxed, highly deferential, and sort of saying it has to appear just truly unreasonable, the decision of the regulator, which is a very difficult hurdle to overcome for someone who is trying to challenge a final decision from a regulator. But now that for appeals from regulator decisions, the standard of review has been changed. There was a case recently, Vavilov, fabulous case about Russian spies having their kids in Canada, and can they be citizens if their parents are spies? And spoiler alert, they can. But part of that decision was the court sort of reassessing. The Supreme Court of Canada went back to that Dunsmuir standard and said, is it true, though, that in a case where the question is, has a regulator exceeded their legal authority or misinterpreted the law, is it true that a regulator really does have more expertise over those types of issues? And the Supreme Court of Canada said no. The courts understand those things just as well as the regulators do, and so they changed the standard from reasonableness to correctness, and that has no deference. So now the court is just saying, were you correct, regulator, when you made this decision? So there is, I think, a sense, there could be some trepidation by regulators now, and some processes have been changed at some, for some regulatory agencies like the Alberta Utilities Commission that sort of reflect this feeling of, well, if we're not going to get any deference from the courts, then we might want to fast track certain types of appeals because we don't want to spend a lot of time on something that's just going to get overturned by the court because they won't give us any kind of deference. There's definitely a relationship between the courts and the regulators. The courts do have that sort of final authority to make a decision with respect especially to law and jurisdictional questions that have been determined by a regulator. And it is true that there is very little deference left on those types of issues for the regulators. So, it does put regulators in the position where the chances of your final decision being overturned by a court are higher now than they previously were.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing because the court gives you guidance as to, well, how far can I actually go? And I've always been of the view that, look, if you want to appeal me, I'll see what the outcome is, and that's going to give me a lot more information about where I can go and where I can't go. But just one little note on the post-Vavilov, there have been a number of appeals since then, and the courts seem to be very confused about now what's the standard of correctness. And in a couple of them, apparently they've come back and it's looking more like reasonableness again. So there's a real lack of clarity right now about exactly what the standard of correctness is supposed to be. And I know that doesn't help any regulator in this room, but it's not as black and white as you might think.
Mark, that's a really good point. And I do think that you still will definitely see courts get decisions from regulators that are so complex and so technical. And so even though you can describe the issue that's being appealed as one of law or jurisdiction, it really requires such specialized knowledge that the courts aren't supposed to be giving any deference, but they're reading these decisions from the regulators and they're like, I don't even understand what this is. And so even though as a judge you're supposed to be sticking to the standard of correctness, I still think practically Mark is correct. There's still going to be places where, so on the one hand, the benefit could be that if the province won't tell you what your powers are, maybe the court will when you get appealed. But on the other hand, it may also be true that a lot of times some of these decisions from the regulators involve such highly specialized knowledge that even when the court knows it has the power to say, I'm a court and I understand the law, they're reading these regulator decisions and they're saying, I don't actually think I have the specialized knowledge I would need to say that in this case the law is wrong. So.
It's actually quite remarkable that we still pretend that regulatory certainty is something that can exist. So I wanted to tie back to something that the first panel said briefly that relates to this about the record and how regulators are tied to what is in the record, right? That their decisions are bound by that. And I want to bring up the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission one more time because they've done something that I think is really instructive and potentially for the situation that Canadian provinces are facing. So 2 weeks ago, FERC issued a NOPR, I don't know if it's the same language here, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So they're about to, in the next 6 months, issue an official rule changing how transmission planning regionally and interregionally needs to happen in the United States. So this goes back to, we do have federal rules around planning, but not federal rules around carbon. But it's exciting from a U.S. perspective. There's a lot of potential here, but it is also quite soft, and that's why I bring it up as potentially instructive for what regulators in Canada could do. Mark, I think, brought up a really important point about markets shifting, which is the role of regulators, and so in many ways, the job is staying the same. It is just about keeping up with where the markets are shifting, and that's absolutely what this NOPR is about that FERC put out. And there's a couple of things that they say regulators and utilities and RTOs should be doing to be aware of this market change. And it's things like looking at scenarios. So when you're doing transmission planning, looking at a number of different probabilistic scenarios and what the different transmission needs are when you're making your decisions. Similar to, we talk about load forecasts, what are different scenarios for load forecasts, just expanding what that record is and changing what questions you are asking about where the generation assets are going to come from, where the stranded assets are going to be. And so I think there's potential for still not necessarily being activists, but changing questions that then changes potentially what's in the record and what gets considered for decisions and also court reevaluation.
So I just want to pick up on the piece about, Leslie, I think you said it well just now, we talk about regulators being activist, and I think activist sometimes, maybe it's a bit of a loaded term, people think of it different ways. So maybe to reframe it, as you just did, in another different way and see where this takes us, I think we can think of a lot of different examples where regulators have had reliability concerns or they've had cost concerns, and there may be instances in those cases where a regulator has said, in fact, my concerns are significant enough here that I'm going to make a deliberate attempt to start to push a utility in a certain direction and advance an objective or on cost, or advance an objective on reliability. So anyone on the panel that wants to jump in, what makes net zero different? When we've seen those examples of regulators pushing on cost, we've seen examples of regulators pushing on reliability. Is net zero different? Why is it different? Anyone that wants to? Yeah, Jason.
So maybe I'll take a crack at this one in that, why is net zero different? Why is it harder? So I was thinking about the observation of the last panel comparing cybersecurity to climate change. And I think what I'd say there is that cybersecurity is obviously something that's within the mandate of regulators because it's a response to a threat out there. And the better comparison in climate change is probably adaptation. That there's a threat out there, systems are vulnerable, to make investments to reduce the effect of that threat is obviously in the interest of ratepayers. Net zero is something different. The equivalent would be, well, now you're expected to contribute to reducing the threat of cybersecurity issues by somehow going and identifying and prosecuting those or participating in these global efforts. Contributing to a global effort to reduce the threat in the first place is very different than addressing your vulnerabilities to it at home. And I think that's what we're dealing with net zero. To what extent are you expected to contribute to this global effort is something that you really need some amount of guidelines from government to really operationalize. Not to say it can't happen absent that, but it's why it's so hard and different.
I think the biggest distinction is net zero isn't one thing. It's a bunch of things that a utility or the utility industry and other players in the market are all going to be doing, and they're all going to be doing it at the same time. So trying to get your arms around how do you achieve net zero, there's not one clear path. There is no clear path. There's a whole lot of ideas. There's a whole lot of proposals. And as a regulator, it's really difficult because it's very difficult to say, well, here is my path. As long as I do these things within my jurisdictional boundaries, I will have moved the yardsticks on achieving net zero. But figuring out that path, that's not very easy, and it's probably risky. So I think that's what the fundamental difference is. And I'd like to see David jump in. I think he's got some thoughts on that, and we've kind of forgotten he's here.
It's easy to get forgotten. I'm interested in the answers. They're very good. And to jump in, I actually really like Jason's answer, and I think you're right too, Mark. The challenge that regulators are going to have to try to kind of steer the ship, as opposed to taking direction and then trying to implement it, is profoundly difficult, because I don't think their staff are equipped quite often to be able to parse out the what to do list in order to then help the utility to go there. And as an example, and I hesitate to bring it up, but if you look at, there has been examples in, the electrical utility space in Canada where some provinces have gotten some policy fundamentals wrong. And I'm not blaming that on the regulator. I'm just saying it's a fraud area to plan ahead to how we're going to green this thing up, and at the same time not hurt the utility, and especially in terms of affordability, which then impacts our industrial ability to use electricity and electrify. So it is a really difficult area to get right for anybody, let alone are the utilities actually equipped to, the regulators equipped to do that. I don't know, like they're and I think the point was made in the very first answer. One of the things government could do, in addition to giving more guidance, is giving the regulators more capacity if they want them to do these kinds of things.
So I want to maybe switch gears here for a bit and kind of get down to tools and tactics, and I'll come to you on this, Mark, but maybe Dave, I'll give you a heads up so you can start thinking about it as well. I think it would be neat to hear this from a government perspective. So broadly, I think looking at the tools that regulators have today, if they want to start to advance towards net zero, how do they do that? And Mark, I'll go to you on that, but Dave, the piece I'll get you thinking about is, as Mark's talking, is, are there tactics that regulators should be thinking of or using if they want to advance certain concerns, certain opportunities with governments? What tactics might work there? But Mark, to you first in terms of tools you see.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's actually a pretty big grab bag of tools that regulators generally have. So you get to approve infrastructure. To the extent that you get to approve infrastructure, you can have a significant influence on the type of infrastructure that has to be put into place in order to achieve net zero outcomes. really important, you get to define services. What's a service? And what types of services do you now have to have put into place by the utility in order to achieve the outcomes that you want? And as part of that, you have an opportunity to unbundle functionality. And the unbundling of that functionality may well move the development of the marketplace in the direction that you want it to ultimately go. You get to set rates. You get to decide what the revenue to cost ratios are in those rates. You get to decide, to at least some extent, depending on your particular jurisdiction, you get to decide what to regulate, and you get to decide what to forbear. And those are really powerful tools, particularly as you start turning your mind to how's the industry have to evolve. And if you think about what your objective needs to be, even though it's difficult to say, well, this is exactly what I need to do in order to achieve net zero, one of the things you can do is applying the tools that you already have to start putting into place a regulatory environment that either facilitates or potentially promotes net zero outcomes. And even though it's difficult to say exactly what those things can be, one of the most powerful tools you have as a regulator, and a tool that I frequently used when I was a regulator, is you have the authority to commence a proceeding on your own motion. You can decide what you want to hear, and you can set into motion a proceeding that provides opportunities for utilities and interested parties to give you guidance on what they think you should do with respect to moving towards net zero. And this is a powerful tool that I think a lot of regulators forget that they have. And as a regulator, and I know because I did the exact same thing, you get trapped in this model where I'm responding to applications. And you're not just a responder to applications. You have the power, to a great extent, to start to direct where you think things should go. And the most powerful tool I think you have to do that is to trigger proceedings on your own motion to get the information you want and to get guidance with respect to where you might ultimately go to put the right regulatory environment into place. So I think that's an incredibly useful tool that I would encourage you all to use. Now let's bump it over to David. I see him there nodding, so.
Yeah, that was really, really, really good answer, by the way. I really agree with everything you just said. To answer your question, on tactics, Chris, and just what I think of is the difference between the regulator as a body and the leader, the head, the chair, the CEO, the leader of the organization. So I'm going to separate that out a bit because, when I'm answering around tactics, I think it's really important that the leader of the organization understand the dynamic that they work in. And this goes back to my comment about every energy minister is different. The politics of governments are very different. Like governments of different stripes have different priorities, and they might all agree on global topics like climate change, but boy, the way they see the role of the utility and how that gets enacted can be very, very different. And so what's the job, or what should the tactic be of the leader, is to understand the context that you're in and be the apolitical kind of bridge between the regulator, which will go on and should be apolitical, but understanding how to bring that context into the kinds of answers Mark just gave. Like that ability to hold hearings that Mark was just talking about, very, very smart, but do it in, understand that context and use those kind of tools to make sure that you're not seen as adversarial at worst, but also not useful, perhaps. And what I mean by that is quite often a manifestation of a failure of the ability to do this well results in the government, the owner of the utility, and ultimately the boss of the Utilities Commission, writing orders which usurp the role that we've been talking about and the opportunity to do those kinds of things. And you'll know when you're not quite getting it right when those orders start happening. And what happens is governments, because they have the authority, will just bypass the systems and decide to implement their agenda in a different way, which to me is the kind of tools Mark just talked about, and the ability of the leadership to keep that context depending upon what's going on around you is really important.
Actually, if I can just jump back in there really quickly, one of the other things that you have, particularly as a chair, is you have the ear of the minister, you have the ear of government, and you can provide advice around where policy needs to go as it applies to your mandate. And I know you know this incredibly well, sir, but I mean, that becomes a big part of your job, right? Like trying to influence what the legislation should say so that you can do your job as the challenges in your job ultimately change. So I think that's a real important aspect as well.
Liza, do you want to jump in here in terms of any tools in the US and how those work and that side of things?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And David, I agree. That was a great list. And I'll try not to just repeat myself, but I'll say that I think the guidance that FERC just issued, I think is just a really interesting document to look at for seeing a different way to interpret sort of these traditional planning roles at the very least. And I think Mark did a much better job at actually listing out what those opportunities would be. But changing the question, and my title is a low carbon energy. I've got a wretched title, but it's going to be electricity transmission technology and policy. And I bring that up because I think I can't say the word transmission enough, and how we think about the role of transmission, and tying back to the earlier question about the challenge of climate change is the question of cooperation, right? And who needs to cooperate? There's a couple of maps I've seen, I'm sure some of you may be aware, of a macro grid that is the US and Canada, right? I mean, there's a lot of cooperation required to do that kind of sharing of power. We have this challenge in the States, I'm sure you have it in the provinces too, but that's a whole series of questions as well, right? What would this solution look like with interregional transmission as opposed to local transmission? And you don't necessarily have to be activist to be asking questions and saying, like, what would that change about markets, about business models, about stakeholders?
Great. Okay, so I think now we'll move kind of to the questions to wrap things up a bit more. So Mark, I think I'll start by going to you. If we go back to our main question, given everything we've talked about, act or wait, where do you fall down on that question, Mark?
Well, anybody who knows me knows I'm not particularly risk averse. So I honestly think that there's risk in action, but there's greater risk in inaction. And the reason that I say that is that markets are powerful things, and markets are going to evolve, and markets are going to do what they're going to do. And in my experience over the last however long I've been in the regulatory and policy world, regulation, legislation, and policy is always chasing markets. You're always behind. You can never get ahead of where the market's going. It's hard enough to keep up with where the market's going. Markets drive change, and policymakers and legislators are always trying to do the right thing, but it's an endless catch-up game. So in my mind, there's greater risk in doing nothing, because you run the risk that your approach to regulation is going to be out of step and you're going to be left behind. So I would encourage you to do everything you can to get ahead of that wave, because the wave is coming. Technological change, the pace of technological change is increasing. The cost of technology is driving down faster than it ever has in our history. And the more important point is, and I've seen some interesting stats on this, the pace of technological uptake is increasing significantly. So I guess my most important message is you don't have time to wait. The markets are going to pass you by, and you should be doing everything you can to try and get your regulatory regime in a position where it will assist in an orderly transition in the markets, in the utility space, because if you don't, that wave's going to pass you by. So my view, there's greater risk in doing nothing or not doing more. I think it's worthwhile to take a reasonable risk and a reasonable approach to thinking about how you want to change the regulatory regime in order to adapt to where net zero is going to take you.
Anyone else want to jump in here, act or wait? If not, we'll switch gears to the last piece here. So what I'll say is this is a helpful panel, and what I mean by that is lots of discussion, lots of things being talked around, so everyone is super excited, super thrilled to go back to your offices and share with your colleagues everything that you've heard and all the insights that have been passed on. I'm sure everyone's going to go back to their families and say, oh, hey, I heard this great panel, here's what they had to say, but hard to kind of like boil that all down into one thing. So that's what this panel is going to do next, is one thing, one takeaway. So maybe Dave, I'll start with you. Thinking of governments, if there was one thing that governments could do, be it federal, provincial, municipal, to advance net zero in the context of electric utility regulation, what would that one thing be for governments?
So federally, I would say, get clear that electricity systems are a provincial domain, and then become enablers in the space that only the federal government can fill, which is back to that point of grid interconnection and building a macro grid and being especially coming to the table with money to help build those interties between the systems and between the provinces and even between Canada and the US. And I think that, as conveners and funders, hugely important. And I'd sum that up by the one thing being, put your money where your mouth is on climate change and do the things that only the feds can do around funding those interties. Provincially, I would say the big job is to align your policy domains. And what I mean by that is instead of having 100 different climate policies that are all ships in the night, all targeted towards under the umbrella of climate, when it comes to this topic, align your carrots and your sticks. So example of carrot, the biggest example of a stick is carbon tax, carbon pricing. Align the policy around an escalating carbon price with enablement carrots around things like programs to help build that infrastructure, programs to help people connect to that infrastructure, programs for fuel switching and motor switching and all those kinds of things. Align your offsetting policies. So I'm only paying net carbon tax instead of gross carbon tax because I'm diminishing my my emissions. And then back to sticks again, use your regulatory sticks to force people to use that infrastructure that you're building. And so it's that alignment of policy could be much, much better, I'd say, provincially. And then municipally, to me, it's, the number one thing that historically there is just the rights of ways and the ability to dig up streets and use the rights of ways and the permitting power of municipalities to help build infrastructure. Again, back to kind of more walking the talk when it comes to this climate change ambition. Thanks.
And maybe Jason, we'll go to you next. Before we talk about regulators, what about utilities? What do utilities need to do? One thing.
I mean, I would say this, so I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but my what I'd say there is the same thing regulators should do, and that's being very clear with governments that this is going to take policy. So ideally, it's the kind of policies that others have been describing of carbon pricing and performance standards. But we need to also recognize that these long-term net zero ambitions, there's always going to be some lag between those ambitions and existing policy. To set it all out rigidly, decades in advance, would be unduly rigid. So recognizing that, there's a gap that needs to be filled here. And provinces, from my experience, don't really want to own this. They sort of will say, well, regulators have their job, that's all well and good. And when pressed, I'll hear things like, well, if need be, we can always overrule the decision of the regulator. I heard that from an unnamed official, and that seems like a strange choice to me, that you would embrace that as a model, because for one, it requires the next government that's in power to choose to do the same, but also you're undermining the independence and authority of the regulator. So that's not a sustainable solution. My view here would be that the status quo setup around how electricity is regulated and governed isn't a neutral choice, that in the net zero context, it needs to be updated to fit that context. So calling for that policy change and making it clear to provinces, you need to do this if you want this to proceed well, would be the main thing I'd call for.
All right, and to finish off then, back to regulators. For anyone on the panel, one thing regulators could do.
I mean, I will repeat myself, which is ask, right? I think that obviously in these forums, there's a lot of unofficial conversations, and I think there's a way to make those official conversations about what's happening for your individual utilities, but also interprovincially, right? Like what are solutions we could come to together?
I would just finish. I think I actually agree with everything that everyone said, because I feel like a lot of us are really saying what we need here is more communication between utilities, ministers, and the federal government. We need more funding. We need more coverage for the utility. If we want regulators and utilities to make, bold choices, in addition to actual directives on how we would like to see that happen coming from the provincial government, it would be nice also to see some money, because a lot of times it seems like what's really holding regulators back from making some decisions in many cases is a concern that it's going to cause costs to go up for ratepayers, or that it might make the business of being a utility uneconomical for the utilities itself, especially in places like Alberta with investor-owned utilities. And so maybe the federal government has a role to play in providing money. I think Dave alluded to that too. But I think what it requires is a plan, not just something top-down like the emissions reduction plan, but something that actually requires coordination between the federal government, provinces, and the utilities working together to actually accomplish something, because climate change and reaching that zero is a global challenge, and trying to move the needle when you're a regulator who's just within one province can feel really difficult to do, because you're overwhelmed with the concerns of your own province, the political issues that are imbued in your own province. But the problem is so much bigger than that. And so I think what we need to overcome that sort of balkanization is that we need to communicate with each other. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for questions.
Great, thank you. Caution, I'm going to use an R-rated word here, politics. So we've had a great conversation about the policy and the regulatory and the legal piece, but the politics, I was just doing an updated check. I'm from Toronto Hydro, and in Ontario, 32 municipalities have passed resolutions calling on the phase out of natural gas. That hasn't been the product of a policy conversation as we would construe it in this room. It's not a part of having regard for their legal authority as municipalities. It's politics. And I think it ties, Liza, into your early example of what was going on in the States. And we're seeing very different dynamics in our politics today, especially on issues involving that intersection of the environment and the economy. And I think that's affecting politicians at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels in a lot of different ways. And I'm just curious how we, as a sector, navigate some of those political challenges, because we are seeing politics get more extreme. And I think it can lead to this is such a complicated problem. even without the politics, that with the politics, it's just hard to imagine how a government that came in saying they were going to fix the hydro mess was their second or third bill in Ontario. And we hear a lot of that rhetoric in a lot of jurisdictions. So anyway, over to you to solve the politics.
Well, one thing I would say, this is absolutely true. Politics, the climate change itself is so highly politicized, and net zero as a response to the challenge of climate change will become more and more politicized too. And one of the things I also think about is somebody from the Alberta Electric System Operator told me once about the number of hearings that they have over wind farms. And he was saying, when we first started seeing big build out of wind in Alberta, we would have these community participation forums and not that many people would show up. Now we do it and a lot of people show up, and they have a lot of very well-defined specific problems with these wind projects. Because, and this is just sort of like a microcosm of how this happens, but the longer that these policies are around, the longer these technologies are around, the more people's positions against certain things can solidify and really become defined. And so one thing I would say, it's certainly not a solution to the problem, but one thing I would say is that for regulators, I think that having those participation processes where you're listening to the concerns of affected communities is really, really important. But there's also some things that are just outside of your ability as a regulator to be able to control or predict. Because, when you have a change in government, a provincial government, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it often feels like the only direction or the most clear direction that regulators get from provincial governments is when something happens and it's having a negative political effect on the current party. And then you'll hear suddenly a lot about what you were doing, where previously you heard nothing. Things like that, I almost feel like it's just the cost of doing business, but the kinds of political things can actually really derail net zero policies. Things like building more transmission, things like building more renewables. Those things, I think, is what happens when there's not enough communication between the regulators and the utilities and the affected communities, because when you're not talking, other people start talking, and then you lose control of the narrative altogether.
Just one thing that we may want to think about is the distinction between politics and the public interest. They don't necessarily line up. And we have a system, or should have a system, where you have independent decision makers who are independent of the politics, or at least theoretically independent, so that they can make decisions in the public interest and not be swayed by the politics at the time, which is why our structure is the way it is. So I think sometimes we just have to remember politics and public interest are not necessarily the same thing.
I think Mark just defined the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So I guess I would say, get yourself a FERC. And I didn't actually come here feeling this strongly about the NOPR, but I found this panel discussion really, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, really instructive for thinking about the value of what was very much seen as a compromise solution, because even though it's an independent commission, they still wanted a bipartisan vote. That there is a lot of value in that sort of action for moving conversations forward, because you cannot color the electrons on the transmission line.
I'm not seeing any other questions.
Yes, we have a question here from our online attendees. I think this might be for you, Chris. The BC government talks about the importance of addressing climate change. A lot of incentives are available for the electrification of everything, yet the two-tiered rate that BC Hydro charges its customers penalizes those who switch their energy usage from carbon-based energy sources. What is preventing BC Hydro from incentivizing the switch to clean energy by charging less as customers use more?
I'll say first, I guess I've graduated now from moderator to a panel member, so things things are looking up. But no, thanks for the question. I'd say a couple things. I think one, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily anything in terms of prevention. BC Hydro's actually been involved in a very active rate design consultation process over the past year or so, working towards a residential rate design application. We're hoping to file that with the BC Utilities Commission actually later this month. So lots of work underway to look at the current residential rate structure, look at that very issue of the step 2 energy charge, where it's at, where it needs to go in light of electrification, in light of electric vehicles, in light too just of costs of supply. BC Hydro filed an integrated resource plan back in December, and one of the things that I think is been interesting in our jurisdiction, and I think for lots of jurisdictions, is how the cost of supply has evolved over time. So the stepped energy charge that we have in BC, like I think many inclining block rate structures that have been developed over the years, really was born out of a context where supply was very expensive, and you wanted that second tier to really send that strong conservation price signal. What do we see today? We see our long-run marginal cost at about 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and that step 2 price is at 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So clearly that's got to reconcile itself. So how does that happen? What does that mean? As I said, residential rate design application to come later this month that'll look at that very issue. In the meantime, we had to make an application to the Commission this year about how rate increases would be applied to those energy charges, and we've actually proposed that rate increases not be applied to that second step, so that it stays frozen, and the first step goes up higher than it otherwise would. And then I guess the last thing I would say is, I think so you could hear all that and say, well, why not sooner? Why not faster? Great that an application's coming. Hope it's going to be a flat rate. Maybe it's a flat rate. But why not earlier? And what I'd say there is, I think, as my colleague, for those of you who were at Camput, Anthea Jubb, talked about when she was on her panel, rate design is always tough. It's a zero-sum game. It's got customer impacts no matter what you do. And so, we took a very deliberate approach through our consultation. We took time to get out and talk to customers. We took time to think about the kind of bill impacts that customers would see as a result of rate design. And I think those processes are always tough to go through and take time to go through, because there's often not a silver bullet rate design that'll satisfy everybody. There's rate designs that will have impacts on either side of the ledger. But I think the concerns are definitely valid. We've been looking at them, and stay tuned.
I would also say governments don't like it when you miss your net income targets either, when you're doing rate redesign. And the other thing I would add to the question, and I don't expect you to answer it, Chris, but it's part of the question, is why not just charging based on consumption or use, but also time of day. I mean, we have the infrastructure. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah. So I'm going to end up setting up lots of anticipation for this forthcoming application. The application we're planning to file in late May will also look at time of use rates and have an opt-in time of use rate offer that'll be put forward. That's one of the things. And again, for those of you that were at Camput, you would have heard Anthea talk about this. That our integrated resource plan looked at was the role that time varying rates can play in shifting demand and meeting the need for capacity that way. One thing I think I'll say there is, those of you who are familiar with the BC context, and I'm not sure if this has been an issue in other jurisdictions, but if you go back 10 years in British Columbia, saying the phrase time of use rates was just, you just didn't do it. It was a very, very taboo subject. To be in a place where we are today, where we put time of use rates forward in an integrated resource plan and got broad support from customers, from stakeholder groups for time of use rates, I think is a real shift. And I think electric vehicles have had a lot to do with that shift. I think electric vehicles are a very tangible example that customers can understand of how you can take a load, forget the person in the panel that was talking about this the other day, but take a load that, I think actually it was someone from Fortis. So some, individuals from Fortis talking earlier about, take a load that, well, yeah, for convenience sake, you might charge it plug it in and charge it at 6 p.m., but actually quite easy to shift it overnight if the utility gives you a price signal, an indication that that's what you should do. And I think that's really shifted a lot of the customer response to time of use rates, because it shifted the conversation from where it used to be of, well, okay, so you're telling me you're going to hike my price up right in the middle of when I want to, do laundry and cook dinner and all these things, and you're going to make it really difficult for me, to serve your own objectives, utility, to now, okay, no, I get it. I can see how, I can shift that electric vehicle load overnight, and I can see why that makes a difference for the utility, and that's something easier for me to do. So I think that really has changed the tenor of the debate around time of use.
Action with the last few minutes, and this will be a skill testing case study for you all to answer. Who would have the best role? So government, regulator, or utility? Let's take the case study as SF6 gas. So this is not a debate between renewables and EV and combined cycle gas. Something as generic as SF6 gas used in distribution systems as an insulating gas. It's a very powerful greenhouse gas if it's released. For net zero reasons, the objective is to eliminate it from the electricity system. Who is best positioned to create that elimination? A utility, a provincial government, or the regulator?
Thoughts from the panel?
It's ultimately, I think, got to come from the utility, because they need to be able to figure out technically how to do it. They need to figure out what the implications to them are with respect to the business implications. And they need to, I think in that case, they need to bring a proposal to a regulator to say, look, here's how I propose we're going to deal with this issue. We're going to deal with this particular problem. I think in that precise example, it's really got to be the utility that has to think it through and figure out how it fits into their longer term strategy and how it fits into their business model. And then obviously the regulator has to be open to trying to figure out how to give effect to it. So that's my sort of off-the-cuff answer.
So I think the interesting thing about this example, I'll talk quickly. I'm the American. I showed up late and I didn't shut my mouth, right? Like, that's my job on this panel. Is that specific example is very specific, which I think is an important difference from what the types of changes that we're talking about are, right? And it is expressly different from thinking about net zero, from thinking about generation changes and transmission changes, because it is very clear what needs to be changed, which is not necessarily the case, even in net zero, right? It's not really clear how quickly the gas needs to go away or how quickly we're going to be able to get CCS. So it's an interesting one, because it is expressly not the regulator as a result, right? It is either the utility or potentially the federal government, because you just make a rule, right? And then the utility just has to figure it out.
Okay, with that, I think we're at time. So I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking the panel, and we'll move on.
All right. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you, Chris, for moderating the panel and magically transforming into a panelist as well. We have one final session, and I'll invite my colleagues to come up and join us. And this is not quite a panel. I think we billed it as an interview, but it's a discussion with the principal authors of the report that I noted earlier. Net Zero, an international review of energy delivery system policy and regulation for Canadian energy decision makers. And our panelists are arriving here. And so we're joined by, well, let's sit in the middle, by Monica Gattinger of University of Ottawa, Mike Cleland, who is with Positive Energy. But Mike, I've known for many, many, many years. Mike was previously at the Canadian Gas Association, the Canadian Electricity Association, Natural Resources Canada, and on and on and on. And so we're glad that you're both able to join us for this conversation this afternoon. And I wanted to chat a little bit about the report itself. And so let's begin with, like, what are the big takeaways, right? And you know, you looked at UK, Western Australia, New York State. What did you learn about these jurisdictions and their paths to net zero?
Great, Thanks, Francis. I want to begin by thanking Electricity Canada and the Canadian Gas Association for the opportunity to work on this project. We really enjoyed it. Also want to thank the researchers who worked on this. So our international case leads, Catherine Porter in the United Kingdom, Andrew Pickford in Western Australia, Bob Yardley, John Stewart, and Jim Coyne, who was here over the last couple of days from Concentric Energy Advisors in New York State, and Dr. Patricia Larkin, who is on the Canadian side of the team and is watching right now on the hybrid side of things. So I want to begin, I guess, just by saying that I would encourage everyone to read the report. There is a lot in there. We can really only scratch the surface in our discussion here today, but I think it crystallizes a lot of what we've heard over the last few days at Campus, as well as in the last couple of panels at this session. So I think I'd say that you know, the biggest takeaway for us is that all of these jurisdictions, as here in Canada, are really just starting on their path to net zero. And so far, not surprisingly, nobody's batting 1,000. That doesn't mean we can't learn from other jurisdictions, and that's, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So lots of things in the report. I really just want to point to maybe 3 key areas, Francis, and we can dig into them and others in the conversation. I think the first is to say that, you know, all jurisdictions, and we heard this on the last panel, are really trying to think through how do you navigate planning in what are fundamentally market-based systems. You know, so as somebody who's studied energy for the last number of decades, it's really striking to me that over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, you know, governments were getting out of the energy space, right? Deregulation, privatization, electricity restructuring, trade liberalization, take your pick. And now they're coming back in as a result of climate, and they're coming back in hard. So I think about it as, you know, sort of this shift from hidden hand to heavy hand. And as we've heard in the last couple of panels, there's a really strong need there then when it comes to policy for clarity, for coherence. Dave Nicolishan was talking about that on the last panel, and for certainty. Not only for investors, but also for communities and for citizens, as well as for cooperation between different jurisdictions, and we heard that loud and clear on the last panel as well. I think the second thing that really came through in all of these jurisdictions is the fundamental importance of taking integrated approaches to these issues. So approaches that integrate, yes, emissions reductions, but also energy imperatives. And for us, of course, this is affordability, but it's also what we referred to in the report as system integrity. So the reliability of our energy delivery systems, their safety, their resilience. And this comes into costs, and I know we're going to get into that in a little bit, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. And then the third thing that really came through strongly in all the cases is the importance of what we refer to as whole of system thinking. Right, so looking at the implications of decisions on the energy system as a whole, and this is where the importance of results based approaches comes to the top. You know, at the end of the day, this is about emissions reductions. So this study, as you know, Francis, was not just looking at electricity, it was also looking at natural gas and gas delivery systems. And so the opportunities there for system optimization, which doesn't often get talked about as much as it could, and the importance of avoiding technological determinism as well. Whole of system thinking also applies, though, and the last panel was a great illustration of this, to machinery of government. So it's thinking through at single levels of government, but also across levels of government, making sure that we've got that coherence between policy through to planning, to regulation, and to individual project decisions. And the role of regulators emerges really strongly in that context. Now, we recognize that, you know, we're not going to get perfect whole of system thinking, but we can sure as heck do a lot better than we're doing now.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll circle back to some of those issues, and what you and I have been discussing over the last couple of days, that the more wicked issues tend to fall into that area. But maybe turn to Mike. Mike, can you talk a little bit about you know, what is, you probably got your own there somewhere. You're sitting on, there you go, Mike. So what about Canada specifically? You know, how does our very specific constitutional arrangement affect things?
Of course, actually having it on helps. Yeah, Francis, let me get to that in a second, but just maybe to expand a little bit on a couple of things that Monica just said. She talked about how, you know, the jurisdictions we looked at are just now actually, unbelievably, since we've been talking about this since Rio in 1992, yep. But in a sense, just embarking on really getting serious about climate change, even though we've been doing things on it for years. And what I'm struck by, and I'm struck by in the context of Canada as well, is in particular understanding it from that downstream energy delivery customer perspective. And I mean that with respect to both the gas and the electric systems. We've tended to ignore that. We've tended to focus on the upstream decarbonization. We've tended to talk about pipelines. We tend to talk about oil and gas. And we've tended to forget about customers. And so, you know, that's something we really need to think about, and that has implications for constitutional jurisdiction. Understanding that downstream system and how it actually operates in the untidy world of all of those customers is going to be a critical factor. And of course, that does take you to the question of where's the jurisdiction lie, and indeed, it does lie, for the most part, at the provincial level. But maybe more important than jurisdiction is who knows the best what's going on, who knows about local conditions, who knows about the different conditions that you find in different jurisdictions, who has the most expertise and knowledge, and frankly, that rests for the most part at the provincial level. So it seems pretty clear that the provinces are going to have to take a very, very big role. We can talk about what should be the federal role, because I think there's some important ones, and ones that we get to in our report. And finally, and this goes to the role of the respective jurisdictions, people have talked about we need a plan. I would argue we don't need a plan. We need planning. And there's a big difference between the two, because one is a plan, it's a thing on a shelf. Mm-hmm. The other is an ongoing process of thinking it through and adapting as we go along. And there, I think there's a huge role for the federal, provincial, territorial governments, as well as other jurisdictional entities such as Indigenous governments, municipal governments, and third-party stakeholders.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, you mentioned customers. Let me read a quote out of the report. There is a vital need to expose consumers and citizens to the realities of energy transformation, costs and risks, as well as opportunities and benefits. The questions surrounding who pays what, when, and how for net zero are pivotal. So, how would you do that? It sounds simple.
Sure.
Nothing to it.
You know, as we often say, you know, it's not complicated but complex.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm really glad you picked up on this, Francis. It's hugely important. We had a number of strategic advisors working with us on this project, bringing policy, regulatory, industry, and legal perspectives to the table. And so names that many of you would know: Dave Morton, who's here in this room, Lisa DeMarco from Ontario, Brian Purchase, and Doug Stout. And you know, one of the things that came forward frequently and loudly in our analysis and discussions was the importance of cost. To the point that we developed this tagline that you just read out of who pays what, when, and how. And that is, I think, you know, something that we have been talking about over the last number of days in a variety of different sessions. And yet cost has largely been absent certainly from our political debates and from public debates on these issues. But it's going to be so important to the level of success Canada and various jurisdictions in Canada will have when it comes to achieving climate ambitions. And I want to just, you know, somebody earlier in the week at Camput mentioned that, and it just really got my goat. They said, you know, if people who raise concern about costs and how much this is going to cost are climate insincere. And I actually think that's a really unhelpful idea. There are a lot of different ideas out there right now about what costs are going to be, and I suspect we would have a difficult time coming to an agreement in this room, but we need the debate over that, and we need to be thinking very carefully about who pays what, when, and how. You know, we do public opinion polling research. Citizens want climate action. This is not, you know, has become table stakes. But how much are they willing to pay for it personally? I think this is where we're going to start to see the rubber hitting the road. And increasingly, I don't think it's going to be an academic discussion anymore. I mean, we heard, I don't know if the fellow from Ofgem is still here, but we heard about what's been going on in the United Kingdom. You know, and you've got a regulator saying, we expect deaths next winter as a result of fuel poverty. You know, next winter, that's a long time away. So this is a jurisdiction with some major supply challenges. You know, our sense is there is going to be a great awakening among customers and among citizens to, to the costs of transition. And governments then are going to be increasingly pressed to answer the question of who pays the costs. Is it utilities? Is it investors? Is it citizens? Is it governments? You know, all the usual suspects. When do they pay them? Do they pay them now? Is it their grandkids paying them? You know, some other approach. And then how do they pay them? You know, through the rate base, if so, how? The tax base, sustainable finance. You know, all the usual suspects. And of course, the reality is going to be some combination of all of the above. So what do we do? Well, first, I think governments need to start preparing citizens for this. It's like, I think about, you know, when I take my kid to the dentist, the first time to the dentist, right? Oh, it's going to be so much fun. But then when you get a little bit closer, you need to prepare that individual for some of the things that might happen that are absolutely for their own good. And we all want these things to happen. We all want emissions reductions, but there are going to be costs associated with this. So we've talked a lot about opportunities and about benefits, but I don't think there has been a lot of discussion about risks and about costs. And I think, you know, that's something that governments, and I recognize that's very difficult to do, but I think the risks of not doing it are, very virulent political backlashes to emissions reductions, and we're certainly seeing this in the UK at the moment. Second, I would say, you know, and this goes to Mike's comment around planning, that who pays what, when, and how, that's going to have to be integrated into our planning processes, whether it's at the policy level, regulation programs, individual projects and the like. And I think, you know, that's not news to anybody in this room, right? Regulators get this. Industry gets this. I think where there's sometimes been a disconnect is with that political level. And then third, I think we need to, you know, it comes back to this idea of taking a systems approach to the issue. So yes, emissions reductions, but also approaches that are going to foster investor confidence, fiscal sustainability, which is something we don't talk about nearly enough, and energy affordability, and all the while maintaining the integrity of the system. And again, we recognize this is a very tall order, but I think failing to achieve, or at least to try in that respect, will likely be leading to failure on emissions reductions as well.
And the longer we delay getting to that day of reckoning, the higher likelihood it is that it'll be challenging.
So it's interesting you use that word reckoning. So, and I've thought on this for quite a bit. I prefer to think of it as a great awakening of customers. It will become a reckoning if it's not managed appropriately. I think the awakening is good. There's actually opportunities there as customers become more aware to learn more about their energy systems.
I guess I misheard. I thought you said great
I hope it's not a reckoning.
Which must have been the filter, because I've been so much in this space. Okay, well listen, let's talk a little bit maybe about the urgency. Urgency to act. And Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about this? How do we reconcile the urgency to act on net zero with the reality of diverse clean energy resource endowments across the country, different legacy energy systems, and the fact that many net zero technologies are still, let's face it, maturing or in development?
Okay, thank you. Francis, and as usual, I can't figure out how to turn my mic.
Just leave it on and let the
light isn't coming.
There you go. The team in the back will manage it.
Yeah, I'm a technological illiterate, in case anybody hadn't noticed. But I do want to come back to this question of cost for a second, because I think it's really, really vital. I remember back in the 90s, back in the days of Kyoto, when we were debating this, and no one wanted to talk about the fact that would entail some hard choices. You couldn't talk about that, because that would scare people off. Well, I guess we didn't scare people off, but we also didn't make the hard choices, and we didn't do anything close to what Kyoto required, and we seem to have kept up that habit for all this time. So maybe it's worth thinking about a different approach. I'm trying to imagine Winston Churchill getting up in the House of Commons in 1940 and saying, "I have nothing to give you but benefits, opportunities, and jobs." I'm not 100% convinced that would have actually won the Second World War. You got to talk to people and treat them as adults. On the question of urgency, maybe I'm going to say something that, Francis, this may be unspeakable to lots of people, but let's make sure that we make the distinction between urgency and importance. And when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about the climate emergency, and of course that necessarily gets us into thinking about urgency. But we do know that rushing into some of these things can mean much higher costs than if we take a more judicious approach, letting the technologies mature, and we've got actual real-life examples of that in the Ontario electricity system, for example. We also know that in terms of actually implementation and operations, there are inevitably going to be glitches. And we're going to have to take that on board, think about how we come at it incrementally. And for any federal public servants who are familiar with the Phoenix Pay system, you may know something about that. These are big, complex systems, and we have to come at them by degrees, learning as we go along, and it may end up taking longer than we wish. One other thing that will take longer than we wish, and other panelists have talked about this, is you got to bring the people with you. You've got to be out there talking to the communities. You've got to be bringing them along. You've got to be thinking about what are the implications for those communities. They've got to see what it means, and that inevitably takes a great deal of time. I guess what I think Monica would agree with me on this, because we've written this in some of the stuff we've done in the past, is we need change, but we need durable change. And the only way we're going to get durable change is if we take into account a lot of those sorts of complexities. It's not as if we shouldn't act. We need to act. Carbon taxes, various regulatory standards, but we also need to build the institutions, we need to build the public support, and we need to build the capabilities that allow us to do it well.
Let's see. Let's make sure we bring the people with us. Let's not build a Phoenix Pay system. But in the report, there is outlined a roadmap of next steps when it comes to energy and regulatory policy. So based upon this roadmap, who should be doing what, and what are the timelines?
Sure. So again, I think it's important to underscore this. A report was not intended to say, here's the answer for Canada. It was to look at what's happening in international jurisdictions in terms of...
Hang on a second now. I think, yeah, when we commissioned the report, we wanted the answer. Here's the answer for Canada.
And do it in 6 months or whatever.
That's right.
I gave you the answer, Francis. Don't worry about it. You just got to read it.
People should know there was a very tight timeline on this project. We had some very committed folks working with us. And again, read the report. It's the international case studies are positively phenomenal. But part of our charge was to identify a process for Canada to actually identify ways in which that energy delivery system decision making should be reformed. So what we've recommended is the creation of a task force, time limited. So this gets to your question, to help Canada move faster and smarter in a more thoughtful fashion on these issues. So at present, there really is, people might disagree with this, and happy to hear this in the Q&A portion, but there really is no single table that would be positioned on its own to do this well. But crucially, we're not calling for the creation of a new permanent body. This is not about institution building in that way. This would be a time-limited task force that would mobilize and catalyze cross-jurisdictional and intersectoral, so it's not just governments, learning, collaboration, and coordination. So what would it look like? A 2 to 3 year process that gets underway now, right? There are provinces and territories that are already working on these issues, and they should be coming together with the federal government, with industry, with Indigenous and municipal governments, with other stakeholders. And again, the idea here is not to say, hold the phone, everybody, we're going to do a task force and put pause on anything that you're doing. Nothing of the sort. This is very much about trying to foster and catalyze faster movement and mutual learning across the country. Crucially, it's also not about imposing a one best way. This is not an exercise to say thou shalt, X, Y, Z in all the jurisdictions across the country. We recognize very clearly that it's going to look different across the country. But really, it's about accelerating, collective and individual action across the country. So it's mutual learning, but it's also shared problem solving. This isn't just, best practice sharing. It can also include joint action. So who does what? Well, I think as Mike pointed out, provincial and territorial governments are really going to be the key actors in this space, given their constitutional jurisdiction. And when we say governments, we mean policymakers. So one of the observations I would make, is that over the last number of days, we've had great representation from the regulatory community, great representation from industry, a little bit less representation from the policy side, and that's going to be so crucial on these issues as we've been talking about. So that's, on the government side of things. Provincial and territorial regulators also, for all of the obvious reasons, crucial players. They know the systems, they know the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of reform. They, are well positioned to identify where some of the regulatory barriers are to reform as well. The federal government obviously needs to be there as well. And this is about, again, it's not about, we're Ottawa, we're here to help you. I don't think that's the approach that we're calling for whatsoever, but more in terms of, accompanying that process, ensuring that the policies, programs, and expenditures, crucially, of the federal government are actually, supporting, not thwarting, energy delivery system reform. Indigenous governments and organizations are also going to be really crucial. I've actually been in conference mode since Sunday of last week, so it's been a while. I've been in Vancouver. The first conference I was at was the First Nations Major Projects Coalition event. And that event, the momentum in Indigenous communities and among Indigenous governments for, emissions reducing major projects is real and growing. Clearly a strong role for Indigenous governments. Industry, of course, don't worry. Definitely need to be at the table. Again, without investment and industry engagement, none of this is going to be possible. I mean, it fundamentally comes down to industry. And then civil society as well, as Mike has already alluded to. And so again, just to kind of reiterate, this is not just about best practice sharing. It can certainly be part of it, but it's about really supporting better, more informed, and hopefully through the process, more accelerated action in Canada on these issues. If it's done well, it can actually surface some of the challenges earlier rather than later and address them proactively rather than being sort of caught on our heels as things go off the rails.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mike, the most recent federal budget had more of a regional approach, or at least that seemed to be signaled in the budget by the government in terms of working with provinces and territories on energy system planning. Is this at odds with your recommendation for the creation of a national regulatory task force?
It doesn't need to be, and in fact, it sounds in some ways like the federal government's moving in the right direction when they say working with the provinces and the territories, and that's a pretty crucial word. When you're my age, you get to tell a few war stories from way back when, and so indulge me. I remember I was a senior federal official back in the 1990s, and I remember one time, I can't remember which province, I showed up in the provincial capital and met with some of my counterparts from the province. And the meeting opened with my provincial counterpart saying, "Well, so you've come out to tell us what to do." And I was so taken aback, I said, "Well, no, actually, I came out to find out what you're doing and make sure that I understand it." He was so taken aback that we actually had quite a good conversation. The federal government, I think, one of the things, and particularly in the downstream energy space, where I know this because of my own experience, the federal government doesn't instinctively understand it. It doesn't come easily. It's complex, it's far away, and it's out of its jurisdiction. So learning itself and making sure that it adapts its policies so that they're consistent with the kinds of things that the provinces, and for that matter, other local governments are doing. It's a two-way street, and it can be a two-way street provided that all governments come at it with the right frame of mind. And you know, with that, and going to Monica's point about taking the time to think it through doesn't mean we have to take more time overall. It means that we can maybe get it right early on, make fewer really bad mistakes, do fewer things to cause public backlash, and again, we've seen that in a variety of jurisdictions when you rush into it. And maybe a way to think about this, and something that the task force, if we get this task force off the ground, can do is help, let's say, instill a slightly different way of thinking, and maybe a way of putting it is winning the race may be more likely to go to the tortoise than the hare. And at least it's worth being open to that possibility.
All right. Now I know somebody was giving me a signal that we're running long, but I don't need 15 minutes for closing comments. So I'm going to take a bit of my time for closing comments and just see if there's any questions in the room. But before that, actually, Vanna, you can see if anybody has a question. But I got a question from Mike, and that is, it's a question that I ask people on the podcast, the flux capacitor. Monica was on the podcast a month or two ago, and in fact, the book that Monica recommended, I'm in the middle of reading right now, so thank you for that recommendation for American War. Mike, do you have a book recommendation that we should add to our book club list? Is there a book that you think folks should be reading?
Yeah, there's one that I would recommend that people think about. I just finished it a little while ago. And I apologize, I can't remember the name of the author, but the title of the book is Prisoners of Geography. And what it is a very wide-ranging exploration of the geopolitical world that we live in right now, but with a particular focus on how elements of geography, and whether that's rivers or mountains or oceans or harbors or climate for that matter, have fundamentally shaped the geopolitical world that we live in, or in some cases it's been overcome by technology, but for the most part has shaped that world and will shape it in many ways into the future. So a fun read, an easy read, a different perspective on geopolitics, which is something I'm sure most people in this room are interested in.
Awesome, great. Prisoner of Geography. Okay, thanks, Michael. Vanna, we're good? Okay, no. Oh, there's one question back here. So we'll take one question and then we'll look at wrapping this.
Thanks, Andrew Pape Salmon from BC. I was just wondering if you could confirm that this body, that the 3-year task force, by necessity includes the federal government, because I think we were hearing earlier about the role of the federal government fiscally. And if so, there was an announcement about the Pan-Canadian Grid Council. Is that a possible fit? When you read the fine lines, it seems very focused on, getting grid connections between provinces and territories that don't currently exist. And another question is, are there examples of successful cooperation between the federal government, the 13 provinces and territories, the industry players in other sectors in Canada, as opposed to other jurisdictions around the world? And one possible example is around infrastructure. So federal-provincial infrastructure collaboration. It's an incredible system. It's been working for years. Another example would be the building code, and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement has established a Regulatory Cooperation and Reconciliation Council. And for the first time, we saw an announcement from Ontario agreeing that the Ontario Building Code will adopt the federal national model standards. So I think we can learn from other sectors in this sector, as opposed to bringing in maybe the UK model or whatever. I mean, I think we can learn from that as well. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay,
yeah,
great questions. Monica, do you want to start off?
Sure, thanks, great question. So just to start on the federal government piece, yes, absolutely the federal government needs to be there. I think it needs to be there in the way that we've just been alluding to, which is sort of as an accompanier, as a convener, if and as appropriate, but with full recognition of the constitutional jurisdiction of the provinces in energy system delivery. But I think one of the key challenges that we're facing in Canada, again, this report, as you know, was looking at international jurisdictions, so we didn't sort of canvass what's happening domestically, but just my own observation would be that one of the biggest disconnects that we're actually seeing is between federal policy and ambition and then what's going on the ground in sort of the real worlds of energy, in this case, energy delivery on the electricity and gas side. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to ensure that we've got more alignment, try to foster greater alignment where there is federal investment, and there will be federal investment, ensuring that that's done, in a way that's actually aligning with needs. I think the other thing I would note, and then I'll pass it to Mike because he's probably got some thoughts as well. The other thing I would note is that as governments, how shall we say, disengaged and restructured energy markets, and we develop sort of market-based systems. If we're now moving from market-based energy systems to policy-based market systems, we have a lot of policy capacity to build up. My background is in public administration, and there's a tremendous amount of policy capacity loss just writ large across governments over the last number of decades. So part of this is also, as Mike was alluding to, about learning for all jurisdictions, but I would say particularly at the federal level, given that there has been quite a, for all kinds of obvious reasons, not a lot of engagement at that distribution level, whether it's for power or gas.
Mike?
And just to reinforce, the federal government needs to be there for a variety of reasons. One thing that always worries me a little bit, though, is inevitably when people say, well, what's the role of the federal government? It's immediately to open its wallet and send money. Yes, up to a point, but look at federal finances and ask yourself just how much room there's going to be when you're done with health care and all of the other things. So it isn't just a matter of federal money. The federal government does have roles, and particularly if we go back upstream into the bulk transmission area and cross-border relations with the U.S., or for that matter, interprovincial transmission. You know, the federal government actually does have a constitutional jurisdiction in that area. The question is, should they use it? And if so, how do they use it? So they need to be, there's no question they need to be at the table, and including for all the reasons that Monica cited. And Andrew, I loved your examples of past examples of when actually it has worked. And maybe we should look back in history a little bit and think about things like, the Columbia River Treaty, where we had across Canada, U.S., and something involving British Columbia, other big infrastructure projects, healthcare, places where governments actually have come together on big complex problems and solved them, or at least come up with pretty good solutions, ones that are legacies that we have today. I won't say that the healthcare system as we have today is necessarily entirely a good legacy, but a lot of it is. And that came from that kind of cooperation. So really good question. We should probably look for more examples and say, well, why did they work or not?
Okay. All right. I do have some comments, but before I make my comments, please join me in thanking Monica and Mike for capping our afternoon. We appreciate it. So there's just a few people that I want to thank and a couple of announcements. First of all, I want to thank all of the panelists who took part today. I want to particularly thank our Economic Regulation Committee and its chair, Curtis Hildebrandt, the Director of Regulatory Affairs at ENMAX, for his support of this event. I'd also like to thank the Electricity Canada team, especially Mayim Ekpo, Patrick Farley, Rewa Murad, and Justin Cruson for all their hard work in the weeks leading up to this. And I want to thank Canput and Cynthia for the assistance and support, giving us this space at the tail end of the conference. Thank our sponsors for this event, Longview Systems and Hitachi Energy. Now, immediately following this, there will be a reception at the Vancouver Club where refreshments and appetizers will be served. Transportation will be provided from just in front of the South Tower, which is just immediately across the courtyard. So 2 floors up to the lobby level and out and across, you'll be able to find that. I started today by reminding people that we have 4,990 days until the end of December 31st, 2035, when the electricity grid is to be net carbon free and dramatically increasing its output. We're not going to get to that date having accomplished this crucial goal unless we modernize our regulatory frameworks. Because the problems we face are not technological. The technologies to build bigger, cleaner, and smarter systems are known. Some of them are already cost effective. It's going to be finding ways to overcome the policy and regulatory barriers that are slowing our progress. We've got much to do, and we've got a limited time in which to do it, and we need to get to work. So thank you for coming today, and as I noted a moment ago, the shuttle bus that'll take you to the Vancouver Club will be leaving from in front of the South Tower courtyard, and that brings us to an end of our Regulatory Forum 2022. Thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you.